Sounds good. Committee on Education and Labor will come to order and want to welcome everyone. I note for the record that a quorum is present. The committee is meeting together in a legislative hearing to hear testimony on the cost of college, student-centered reforms to bring higher education within reach. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, opening statements are limited to the chair and ranking member. This allows us to hear from witnesses sooner and provides all members with adequate time to ask questions. I now recognize myself for the purposes of making an opening statement. This morning marks the first of 5 bipartisan hearings which will inform our work on comprehensive reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. I want to thank the ranking member and her staff for working cooperatively with us to arrange all 5 of the hearings. I also want to thank our witnesses for being with us today to answer questions and provide their valuable expertise. Our timing could not be better. Yesterday's news was a powerful reminder that elements of our higher education system are in desperate need of repair. The alleged use of bribery and fraud to game the college admission system illustrates the reality in our higher education system. That is, students from wealthy families and students from poor families are not treated fairly. It is important to note that all of the indicted people in this scheme are entitled to a presumption of innocence, but at least one has pleaded guilty, so we know that the scheme was going on. The reality of this is maddening and inflammatory. Is the illegal and systemic inequality of college admissions that ultimately deprive countless students of their chance to reach their full potential. Our education must be an engine of economic mobility for all students, not an instrument for preserving the elite status of wealthy families. In rewriting the Higher Education Act, we have an opportunity to address many factors that prevent students, particularly students of color and low-income families, from attending institutions of higher education, and those same factors often perpetuate racial and income inequality. This committee has a difficult challenge. The competing proposals released in the last Congress, the Republican Prosper Act and the Democratic Aim Higher Act, illustrated the vast differences in our approach to higher education. This hearing will begin the process of finding areas of common ground. The goal of our work in this committee on the higher education is not just to write a new higher education bill, but it's to pass a comprehensive higher education bill. Accordingly, we propose to work together in a bipartisan way that produces a bill that can pass the House, pass the Senate, and be signed by the President. Students, families, taxpayers, and institutions of higher education deserve a good faith effort on our behalf to address the urgent challenges facing the higher education system. Today, we're discussing one of the biggest challenges, the rising cost of college. The cost of attending public colleges has risen dramatically in recent years. While from 1990 to 2015, the median household income increased by 12%, but the net cost of attending college increased by 81%. When President Johnson signed the Higher Education Act, he said that a high school student anywhere in this great land of ours can apply to any college or any university in any of the 50 states and not be turned away because the family is poor. That could have been the case in the 1960s and 70s, but it is not the case today. In 1980, the maximum Pell Grant covered 76% of the cost of attending a 4-year public college. Today, the maximum Pell Grant covers only 29% of that cost. There are many factors that have led to rising costs of college, but none more significant than the decline of state investment in higher education. You have a chart on higher education? This shows the change in investment from states. Red is how much less they're paying, and the blue is how much more they're paying. We can see that a decade ago, states paid on average about 2/3 of the cost of higher education. Today, states pay on average less than 1/3 of the cost. Going from 2/3 to 1/3 doubles the cost of education to the students, and it's only going to get worse. Adjusted for inflation, 45 states spend less per student in 2018 than they did 10 years before in 2008. As tuition continues to outpace both wages and Pell Grants, it should not be a surprise that students and their families are asking themselves if college is even worth the cost. The evidence and research demonstrate that given well-supported and responsible institutions of higher education, the answer is overwhelmingly yes, it is worth the cost. A college degree remains a good investment for students and families, as well as local communities and the national economy. Individuals with a bachelor's degree typically earn about $1 million more than a high school graduate over their lifetime. Individuals with an associate's degree earn about $400,000 more than a high school graduate over their lives. 2 out of 3 jobs in the modern economy are filled by individuals who have more than a high school education. And we see in this chart those after the recession, you see those with a college degree recovered, those with just a high school diploma on the bottom didn't do well, those in the middle got kind of in between, but you can see those with college educations did much better during the recovery. College-educated workforce is also good for local economies. Evidence shows that for every dollar a state invests in higher education, it receives about $4.50 in return in higher tax revenue and lower spending on public assistance. Colleges also contribute to the cultural and financial strength of communities across the country. We know that universities represent the largest employers in 10 different states around the country, and in rural areas, they are invariably the largest employer in the county. We also know that economic competitiveness is, to a large extent, based on the availability of well-trained, well-educated workforce. Even though college enrollment and completion is a matter of economic competitiveness, only 48% of Americans 25 to 34 have obtained some sort of post-secondary credential. In Canada and Japan, it's 60% have obtained some kind of post-secondary education. In Korea, 70%. We do not address the rising costs. The rising costs will not only lose our economic competitiveness, but a growing number of students and families will lose out on the benefits of a college degree. This is particularly true for low-income students and students of color who already face significant barriers to attending college. Today, we'll consider a broad range of solutions to make college more accessible and affordable to individuals from all backgrounds, including halting increases in college costs by encouraging more state and local investment in public institutions, restoring the purchasing power of Pell and expanding eligibility, including short-term, high-quality programs that provide both valuable technical skills and a path to 2- and 4-year college degrees so that students will be able to afford college, and making college student loans cheaper and easier to pay off while providing additional support for low-income students, such as federal work-study, which empowers students to earn while they are in college. The evidence of the benefits of college degree are all around us. In the recently completed 115th Congress, we found that all 100 United States senators had college degrees, and more than about 94% of the members of the House held at least a bachelor's degree. We, of all people, should not be discouraging students from seeking the kind of education that got us here today. If we only tinker around the edges and do not make comprehensive steps to addressing access and affordability, we will fail to serve the students, parents, and communities we were elected to serve. In some, we will fail the nation, and that simply should not be an option. So I look forward to our discussion and now recognize the ranking member, Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for your commitment to our working on this issue in a bipartisan fashion. This hearing cuts to the heart of why post-secondary education reform is necessary and why it is so difficult to accomplish. It's necessary because college is so increasingly expensive. For decades, tuition and fees have risen higher than the cost of inflation. Because costs have always varied between different types of institutions, it's often hard to know what option would provide the best value for the unique needs of each student and their families. Here's a way to put the cost of college into perspective. If the price of cars had risen at the same rates tuition and fees have risen, The average car today would cost more than $80,000. The high cost of college is not a question for debate, it's a matter of fact. It's also why change is so difficult. High costs for all mean very, very high payouts for some. As a former college administrator, I know firsthand the complexity and the ripple effects of budget decisions at the institutional level. Sometimes it takes creativity and resourcefulness to manage an institution's finances well. Sometimes the easiest way to grow your budget is to use an old business mindset and simply pass costs to the consumer. In this case, the consumers are students and families, and they're not willing to take the high cost anymore. There are ways to protect students from absorbing the cost of institution-level budget decisions. And I must say, I don't believe every college administrator in the country is giving students the consideration they deserve when deciding how to manage institutional finances. Any discussion of college affordability must involve serious questions about institutional accountability. I hope we'll hear more about that today, and I hope we'll all have the courage to confront those who seek to maintain the status quo at the expense of students for their own benefit. The federal government's role in trying to help families pay for college is a classic example of the unintended consequences of good intentions. On top of the different types of grants available, the federal government deals in 5 loan programs, 9 repayment plans, 8 forgiveness programs, and 32 deferment and forbearance options. Somehow, all these numbers and options have added up to more than $1.5 trillion in student debt and counting, a number no Congress could have anticipated as each of these federal aid options came online. These facts should be further indication that college costs are not simply a matter of supply and demand, or loan amounts or interest rates, but a symptom of deeper systemic flaws in American post-secondary education systems, and perhaps more importantly, popular perceptions and values. I've long said we need bold reforms in post-secondary education if we're going to make the system work for students again, and I've put those ideas forward. I believe in the necessity of comprehensive reform today more than ever. However, I'm happy to acknowledge that there are a few bright stars in the system as we know it. The comparative success of the Pell Grant program has made it the cornerstone of federal student aid. In today's economy, there are ways to strengthen the Pell Grant program in ways that may not have been evident in previous decades. And that comes back to my point about public perceptions. If we consider ways to make Pell Grants applicable to shorter-term, skills-focused programs that meet the needs of students and the communities in which they live, I believe we'll see a higher, faster, and more satisfying return. All education is career education. American students view post-secondary education as a necessity, and they aren't wrong in thinking that way. As we broaden our ideas of what post-secondary options can look like for students of every age, the question of how they'll pay for it looms large. I'm glad to see increasing public interest in this issue, and I welcome this hearing and these witnesses today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements to the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by Tuesday, March 26th. Now introduce our witnesses. Dr. Douglas Weber is Associate Professor of Economics and the Director of Graduate Studies at Temple University. He holds a PhD and Master's in Economics from Cornell and undergraduate degrees in Math and Economics from the University of Florida. He has published on many topics in the field of labor economics, and current research focuses most heavily on higher education finance and the returns returns on investment by going to college. Dr. Allison Morrison Shatler is the Interim Chancellor at Western Carolina University, where she serves as Chief Executive Officer for the university and oversees all major divisions of the university, including academic affairs, administration and finance, student affairs, and legal affairs. She has nearly 35 years of experience working in higher education in 8 institutions in 3 countries and in both public and private universities. Janae Parker is the first in her family to graduate from college, obtained an Associate of Applied Science in Human Resources Management from Columbus State Community College in December. She is now enrolled at Franklin University, a four-year institution where she plans to obtain her bachelor's degree in Human Resources Management by the fall of 2020. She is a student parent, and her 8-year-old daughter joins us in the front row today. Dr. Beth Akers is a senior fellow at Manhattan Institute. Prior to her role in Manhattan Institute, she was a fellow at the Brookings Institute, the Brookings Institution's Center on Children and Families, and a staff economist on President Bush's Council on Economic Advisors, where she worked on federal student lending policy as well as other education and labor issues. She received a BS in mathematics and economics from SUNY in Albany and a PhD in economics from Columbia. James Quayle is president of the Institute for College Access and Success, a nonprofit organization that works on issues of affordability, accountability, and equity in education. He previously served as the Deputy Director of the White House Domestic Policy Council and has senior roles in the U.S. Department of Education, U.S. House of Representatives, and the U.S. Senate. He taught at University of Michigan's Ford School of Public Policy and attended Stanford University and Harvard Law School. We appreciate all the witnesses for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have your written statements, and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D and committee practice, each of you is asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. Let me remind the witnesses that Title 18 of U.S. Code, Section 1001, makes it illegal to knowingly and willfully present false information to Congress. But before you begin your testimony, please remember to press the button on the microphone in front of you so that you will be able to turn the microphone on so that the members can hear you. As you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow to signal that you have 1 minute remaining. When the light turns red, we'd appreciate it if you could summarize your testimony and wrap up. We will let the entire panel make presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember again to turn your microphone on. We'll first recognize Dr. Weber.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, and distinguished members of the committee, I sincerely thank you for the opportunity to testify today and for your interest and devotion to college affordability. My name is Doug Weber, and I'm an associate professor of economics at Temple University, where I focus on higher education finance and the returns to college investment. Affordability is about access, the value of a degree, and the risk associated with the investment. I say with great confidence that college is a risk worth taking for the vast majority of individuals and is worth the considerable public investment that we make in trying to ensure that a quality education is affordable for anyone who wants it. But the price of college has outpaced inflation over the past several decades, making college less affordable. The high prices and prospect of significant debt deter low-income students, including highly qualified low-income high school students, from ever enrolling. Higher debt loads and the fact that we have a complicated repayment system that does nothing to automatically place distressed borrowers into income-driven repayment plans have increased students' risks, particularly for students who do not complete a degree. The factors driving the increasing price of college are complex and vary greatly across sector. My research has found that at public institutions, state divestment is responsible for roughly 30% of tuition increases since the year 2000 and 41% of increases since the Great Recession began in 2007. Possibly the biggest single driver is known as Balmola's cost disease. The returns to very high levels of education, such as a PhD, in the private sector have increased dramatically over time. For example, in my field of economics, the combination of modern computing technology and econometric skills taught in most PhD programs have caused private sector salaries for economics PhDs to rise substantially. This increased competition from the private sector pushes up the salary that a university must offer to hire an economist. The difficulty here is that rising instructional costs are driven by market forces completely outside the control of universities. The problem is that as tuition has increased, low-income individuals have found themselves with little money to pay for college. For starters, the purchasing power of Pell Grants has declined considerably over time. The maximum available Pell Grant of $6,095 covers only 30 to 40% of the annual cost of attendance at the average four-year public school. This is down from 80% in the 1970s. The decline in purchasing power is largely due to non-tuition expenses, such as housing, food, and other school supplies. At the typical public institution, tuition comprises only a quarter of the full cost of attendance. As college prices have increased and the purchasing power of Pell Grants has decreased, more students are working during school. 70% of college students work. Over half of those work more than 20 hours per week. This is problematic, as needing to work this much has been shown to lengthen the time it takes to get a degree and also reduces the likelihood of graduating. More students are taking out loans. Today, 69% of students borrow to pay for college, with the average four-year college graduate owing roughly $30,000 in federal and non-federal debt when they leave school. Although our system of need-based aid and loans is often needlessly complicated, it does help students enroll and graduate. To conclude, the picture of affordability is very complex. The financial value of a college degree has never been higher, but the downside risk has also increased over time, particularly for those who do not graduate. And unfortunately, wealth and family background play an important role in college success. In one striking statistic, a high-achieving student from a low-income family is less likely to graduate from college than a low-achieving student from a high-income family. For more on how the wealth gap impacts student outcomes, especially along the dimension of race, see the excellent research of a colleague of mine from graduate school, Dr. Fenaba Addo of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Dr. Jason Houle of Dartmouth University. I think there are many areas of bipartisan agreement that will lead to a better future for the students of this country, particularly as it relates to accountability, which is something that I've done a lot of work on. Thank you all for this opportunity to come before you today. I'm eager to help in any way that I can, both today and in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Morrison-Shetler.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Alison Morrison-Shetler, and I'm the Interim Chancellor of Western Carolina University, the westernmost institution of the globally recognized University of North Carolina system. Our mission is to serve our region and our community. Our student body reflects that. Approximately 43% of the Western Carolina students are Pell Grant recipients, and 40% are first-generation college students. Western Carolina University has enjoyed great success over the last 7 years. Enrollment has soared to more than 11,600 students. Freshman retention has increased from 71% to 80%, and our 6-year graduation rate has risen from 50% to 60%. As a regional comprehensive university, we know the lion's share of the work needed to lift families out of poverty happens at universities like ours. We take that responsibility very seriously. This past fall, Western Carolina implemented a bold and innovative program created by a forward-thinking North Carolina legislator to strengthen our crucial role as an engine of economic mobility, make college more affordable for every student, and to provide access to truly affordable higher education that leads to timely graduation and a transformed future for our students. North Carolina has long and proud history of generous support for its public universities and ranks 5th nationally in both per pupil and per capita spending towards higher education. Our state recognizes that our universities drive economic development, create jobs, and unlock opportunities for our students and communities, large and small. With this in mind, North Carolina General Assembly has taken important steps to invest in, rather than divest from, public higher education. In 2016, the General Assembly implemented a fixed tuition program across the system that guarantees a student's tuition won't change for 8 consecutive semesters. The following year, a cap on student fees limited increases to no more than 3% per year, helping keep inflationary costs at a reasonable level. 2016 also saw the creation of NC Promise, one of the country's boldest moves in providing a radically affordable college education. NC Promise sets tuition at $500 per semester for in-state students and $2,500 per semester for out-of-state students at 3 UNC system institutions: Elizabeth City State University, the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, and Western Carolina University. The state pays the difference between what it used to cost before NC Promise to the tune of $51 million this first year alone. For context, that's around 1.5 times Tennessee's investment in their innovative free community college program, Tennessee Promise. The goals for NC Promise are clear: increase access to higher education, improve affordability, reduce student debt, and continue to grow North Carolina's economy. I hear from my students every day that this program is a game changer. It is opening doors. It is changing the trajectory of their lives. It is setting them up for success beyond their expectations. And NC Promise impact on decreasing student debt is significant. NC Promise is unique compared to most access programs nationally because it is a first dollar scholarship. That means the tuition price comes down before any other financial aid is awarded. Under NC Promise, Pell Grants, state scholarships, and institutional aid go a lot further. For example, at Western, the program allows an in-state student who graduates in 4 years to save approximately $12,000. That's nearly equivalent to the total cost of attendance for one full academic year. So is NC Promise working? Unequivocally, the answer is yes. At Western Carolina University in fall 2018, total undergraduate enrollment grew by 6.6%. At UNC Pembroke and Elizabeth City, the two other NC Promise institutions, enrollments grew by 14% and 19% respectively. At Western Carolina University, the number of first-time, full-time freshmen increased by 10.5% and transfer students by 40.5%. In a survey of our fall 2018 entering class, almost a third of our new students with significant financial needs said that if it had not been for NC Promise, they would not have been able to attend any college or university. These numbers are hard to ignore. All three NC Promise institutions are located in historically underserved parts of North Carolina. Pembroke and Elizabeth City are both historically minority-serving institutions. This program is a target intervention that lifts up the communities and families who need it the most. There should also be no question that an educated leadership ready for workforce is absolutely essential for economic development. We know that an affordable college degree can transform a student's future. North Carolina's overall investment in higher education and the groundbreaking NC Promise program is a resounding win for all. Students win, their families win, the businesses that call our state home win, and we are a step closer to creating a thriving economy and a better life for all of our citizens. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you. Ms. Barker.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, and the members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. The price of college is a subject I know a lot about, and so does my 8-year-old daughter, Journey Marie. On TV, college looks like a lot of fun. Students live in dorms, eat pizza on campus, relax at the gym between classes. It really seems like a mini vacation. But that image is nothing like what I've experienced in real life. I suspect the reality is far more common than the media stories. It needs to be a greater part of the conversation about the real college experience that Americans are having. I'm 29, I'm a parent, like nearly 1 in 4 college students. I'm also a single parent, like 14% of students. 11 years ago, I graduated from high school and went to the University of Toledo. Money was so tight that I did not have a comforter when I arrived on campus. The university cost over $25,000 per year, and all I got was a Pell Grant of $4,300. I borrowed $20,000 in federal and private loans and worked at Starbucks, a grill, and also Target. It was exhausting. I could not focus on school, and 2 years later, I dropped out. Time passed. I got married, I had Journey, and I also got divorced. In 2013, I was working full-time and decided to try college again, this time at Columbus State Community College. I juggled full-time work and full-time college while raising my daughter and caring for my mother who had fallen ill. I loved school, but when my mom passed away, I had to also care for my 2 teenage brothers. Again, it seemed college wasn't in the cards for me. The third time I enrolled in college part-time and worked several part-time jobs. It was slow, but it was the only way I could afford school. Many people think community college is already free, but Journey and I know that's not true. Our bills got so tight we ran out of money for food, and this wasn't about ramen. We lacked enough money to eat regularly. Then we were evicted. I thought this was my fault. But then I realized that 50% of college students are also dealing with food and housing insecurity. More than 1 in 10 are homeless. Are we all just not college material, or have we all done something wrong? Eventually, I found a college staff member who referred me to childcare, health insurance, food stamps, a scholarship, and housing in Scholar House. And I succeeded. In December of 2018, I earned my associate's and transferred to Franklin University, where I'm now pursuing a bachelor's in human resource management, and I also plan on a graduate degree in psychology. It seems that for Pell recipients like me, the only way to attend college and eat is to use food stamps. But what happens to the millions of students who can't get that help? The U.S. Government Accountability Office recently said that 2 million students are having trouble paying for college, but not getting help from SNAP. Like me, most are first-generation students. Many are also single parents. For me to go to college and to focus, I had to know that my child is safe. But 95% of campuses with childcare have long waiting lists, and some campuses do not have childcare at all. I'm here today because of my daughter. I'm also here for students like me around the country and students like those that Journey will become. I know the odds are low that Journey and I will ever escape poverty, but I also know that a college education helps, and we will. I am clearly willing to work for this bachelor's degree, but on days when money is tight and the bills are due, I wonder why I am paying for the price for a badly broken system. What would happen if Congress instead built a college financing system that matched the strength and ambition of today's students like myself? I hope my story makes clear how desperately we want to improve our lives and how very real the struggle of paying for college has become. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Dr. Akers.
Good morning, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, and members of the committee. My name is Beth Akers, and I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where I conduct research on higher education in the United States with a focus on finance. I've now worked in this space for over a decade, first in my position as staff economist with the Council of Economic Advisors, and at the Brookings Institution as a fellow in both governance and economic studies. Thank you for the opportunity to share my testimony here today. College is expensive and getting more so every year. This inflation, combined with the growing enrollment among less well-off students, is driving student borrowing to tick up year after year. The current outstanding balance of $1.5 trillion is the highest level in history. But it's important to remember that spending on higher education is, at least on average, worth it. The increase in earnings that comes from having a college degree tends to outweigh the upfront costs of enrollment. This makes debt a reasonable mechanism for helping students to pay for college. For those who do go on to see a positive return on their spending, the problem of affordability is an issue of liquidity or being able to borrow from their future earnings and not an issue of price. This notion is borne out by the statistics. While the popular media has frequently told stories of borrowers struggling with repayment, like the dental student who managed to amass $1 million in student debt, the vast majority of borrowers have small balances, reasonable payments relative to their income, and are eligible to take advantage of safety nets that will reduce or stop payments in times of financial hardship. The reality is that few borrowers have astronomical balances. As of 2015, just 5% of borrowers had balances in excess of $100,000. And many of those borrowers had completed graduate or professional programs that would lead to high-paying careers. While it is the responsibility of the media to cover the dire circumstances of the few, I'm afraid that this has distorted our collective impression of the magnitude of the college cost problem. But knowing they are in the minority will provide little comfort to borrowers who find themselves underwater on their educational spending, nor should the infrequency of this problem cause policymakers to turn a blind eye. Sadly, many students are spending on college only to end up worse off financially than if they hadn't gone in the first place. College is risky, and it is this risk, not the price of college, that is untenable. The system of higher education finance that we have in place today is not fundamentally out of sync with the challenges we face, but a small number of important policy changes could bring it closer in line with our collective objectives. First, we need to shore up the safety net for borrowers and redesign it so that it operates effectively and is fiscally sustainable. It should be simple in design and foolproof to utilize, such that all students, not just those who are intensely financially savvy, can factor its existence into their enrollment and spending decisions. To accomplish this, we need to replace the existing system of federal lending with a single loan program that collects loan repayment through a plan that ties monthly payments to a borrower's income. There will always be a tension between providing a safety net and diminishing the incentive for people to be self-sufficient. Moral hazard is inevitable, but smart program design can ensure that safety nets are as efficient as possible and do not create incentives for perverse behavior like those that exist in the current system. We also need to work to mitigate the financial risk of college enrollment by empowering consumers with better information. The introduction of the college scorecard during the Obama administration was a tremendous step forward. We should continue these efforts by improving and expanding the information that is available to students as they shop for college. And before we consider increased spending on subsidies, we need to make our current spending work harder for students and taxpayers by moving dollars from hidden and inefficient channels like tax benefits and interest rate subsidies to places they will do the most good. I believe all federal subsidies to higher education should be delivered through a single means-tested grant program that delivers the most aid to the least well-off students. With these primary changes in place, we should also look for ways to support new low-cost business models that can put downward pressure on prices at all institutions. Innovation in higher education marketplace is currently limited by the constraints on access to federal financial aid. It is challenging for innovative startups to compete with traditional institutions when their students cannot access federal grants or subsidized student loans. We should continue to the work started with the EQUIP program under the Experimental Sites Initiative to explore how best to extend federal student aid dollars to new low-cost providers. Lastly, I urge you to reject the growing demand to make college free. Universality would be justified if there were fundamental barriers to a functioning marketplace in higher education, but no market failure exists that isn't rectifiable through subsidies, provision of credit, and appropriate regulation. Embracing universality in post-secondary education would come at a tremendous financial cost, but would also rob us of the byproducts of a competitive marketplace: innovation, quality, and adequacy of supply. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to answering all of your questions.
Thank you. Is it Dr. Quall? Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Quall.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, and members of the committee, thank you for the great privilege of being here today. American colleges and universities are nearly unmatched in their potential to create opportunity and raise living standards. But over the last generation, we've had a sea change in how we pay for college. States have cut funding for public colleges and universities, and that drives up tuition for the 3/4 of students who attend public universities and community colleges. Higher costs mean many students do not enroll. There's a long line of research that suggests that each additional $1,000 in costs reduce enrollments by 3 to 5 percentage points. Other students work long hours or enroll part-time, often at the expense of academic success. Some go hungry or homeless. Only 58% of our students earn a degree within 6 years. The most common reason they give for dropping out is to earn more money. It's not surprising then that students with high-earning parents are 5 times more likely to hold a college degree. Latino adults are only half as likely to hold a college degree as other Americans, and Black adults only 2/3 as likely. Growing college costs have also created a concentrated crisis in student debt. While most students benefit from college and repay their loans, millions of students fall behind on their loans, default, or see their balances grow over time because their payments are smaller than accrued interest. Struggling borrowers tend to have smaller loans, often because they dropped out of college. Others successfully completed but attended low-quality programs. For example, one study found that certificate programs at for-profit colleges leave students worse off on average because their increased learnings are smaller than their student debts. Over 1 million students a year default on their loans, suffering punitive consequences that can drive them deeper into debt. The experience of Black borrowers in particular is deeply disturbing. 70% of Black borrowers are projected to eventually default. These problems were a generation in the making, and reversing them will not happen quickly. However, I offer 3 recommendations. First, Congress should set a goal of doubling the Pell Grant, which is the level needed to end disparities in college affordability. It may not be able to double the Pell Grant immediately, but it should at least increase Pell Grants faster than inflation every year. It should also make them a true entitlement to protect them from the economic cycle. Second, Congress should build a new relationship with states. Federal efforts to make college more affordable simply cannot succeed without robust state investments alongside them. A new partnership with states should prioritize low-income students, consider the full cost of college, not just tuition, and address inequities in how states fund the colleges, enrolling the most low-income students and students of color. Finally, Congress should make it easier to repay loans as a share of income. Students in income-driven repayment plans are less likely to fall behind on their loans. They actually pay back more as a result, and they are financially healthier overall. However, improvements in IDR are needed. The 5 existing programs should be combined into a single plan that sets payments for all borrowers at 10% of income above a living allowance. It should be easier for students to enroll and to certify their incomes, and after 20 years of payments, any remaining balance should be forgiven. Some final observations. First, too many unnecessary defaults occur because of the low quality of the private companies that collect student loans for the Department of Education. I urge Congress to hold these companies to high standards. Second, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program encourages graduates to become teachers, nurses, service members, first responders, but the program is far too complicated and poorly run. In the first round of applications, 99% of applicants were denied. We should retain this program, but we should simplify it. Finally, the issue of affordability is intertwined with the question of accountability for student outcomes. Some colleges routinely leave students with unaffordable loans. I urge the committee to carefully consider how accountability can improve the value that colleges offer students and taxpayers. After decades of shifting the cost to students, it's important to remember that we all have a stake in helping more Americans graduate. Investing in Pell Grants, partnering with states, and ensuring loans are affordable are a realistic path to help bring about the society we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I thank all our witnesses for their testimony. Now we begin with our members' questionings. I'll reserve my questions to the end and call on the Chair of the Higher Education Subcommittee, Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. Thank you all for being here, particularly our student who's here to represent someone who's more close to this process than some of us are. And I want to also mention very briefly, because we can all imagine how many students and parents are anxiously awaiting those letters on admissions today, and how in many ways powerless they must be feeling when they know they worked hard, played by the rules, and yet we have this scandal that we're all going to be following, and it hurts many communities, even in San Diego. I know that the news is hitting hard. I wanted to go first to Dr. Weber, and you were mentioning in your testimony how public institutions respond to state budget cuts by increasing their tuition and cutting spending. Can you talk a little bit more how the cutting of spending actually can be far more detrimental to students in some cases than even the increase in tuition?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that question. And I also wanted to briefly mention that I'm legally blind, so I sincerely apologize if I'm not making eye contact with you at this moment. So spending matters quite a bit for graduation, and there are many low-resource institutions that simply aren't able to provide the services that, especially many at-risk students currently need for graduating. And as we've talked about already today, the students who are at the greatest risk in terms of student debt are the ones who don't get the degree. So to the extent that spending cuts hurts the likelihood of graduation, that's potentially even more damaging than a rising upfront cost.
How do you think, and maybe others can answer this too, that our public institutions have addressed this problem? What are they doing specifically?
So I think there are many different ways that different states have, tried to address this. So there are a number of states that have implemented promise programs, like
Right, we did hear from.
like North Carolina. I mean, my colleague to my left might be better equipped at addressing that than me.
I think the investment of the state has been unprecedented in North Carolina, and as a result, being able to ensure that the students receive the kind of support that they need to be successful is paramount. And so having the option to increase the number of students and therefore increase the need for these resources, or increase the number of students and decrease these resources, goes counterproductive to the success of the students.
Right, and I know that you addressed briefly, and others, just how that matters to the outcomes, because we have students who unfortunately are taking longer. In some cases that might be okay, but it also costs them a lot more to do that, and it has a greater burden on the institution. How have the outcomes been represented in that way?
So North Carolina's system has a series of metrics as part of their strategic plan, and we are held to those and we are accountable for those. And with North Carolina Promise, what we are finding even in the first year, that we've had an increase in enrollment of low income and rural students, and that that metric is something, I'd say, we're held accountable to be able to see that increase, because there's a reduction in the cost of attendance. Really means that we have to make sure that we have the resources available to make sure that they are successful in their time to graduation. So we're also seeing retention as being a big component of this, and resources need to be put in place so that we can continue to retain our students so that they are successful, graduate on time, and then leave to get good jobs where they can then become good citizens of the community.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Kral, you were talking about accountability as well. I think you've all kind of mentioned that in terms of the ability of students who actually attend some of the for-profit institutions to be able to graduate and be able to pay back loans because they're earning reasonable amount of money that represents their effort. Could you speak about our military and how, in fact, we know our veterans, our active duty personnel, and certainly their families are affected by this, that they've really been shortchanged on many levels and are really a target of some of these institutions. How is that affecting them?
Well, we have seen some of the deceptive and high-pressure recruiting tactics at for-profit colleges focus on service members and veterans. And there are really two reasons for that. One is GI Bill benefits and military education benefits can be quite generous. The second reason is for-profit colleges by law can only receive up to 90% of their revenue from federal student aid. But that limitation does not apply to veterans or military benefits. So for every veteran they enroll with GI Bill benefits, they can enroll an additional 9 students with federal student loans. And so that has led to some of the extreme pressure on military service members and veterans.
Thank you. I know, Mr. Chairman, the time is up, and perhaps at some point we can talk about how the federal government can address that better. Thank you.
Thank you. The ranking member will defer. Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, Ms. Parker, you hang in there. You're going to make it. I want to confess that if it weren't for the small university, Austin Peay, in my hometown of Clarksville, Tennessee, I would not be sitting here today. I went to dinner the other night on 8th, not a very expensive place, and 2 of us, my wife and I, had dinner, no alcohol, and that cost more than a quarter of college. I was able to go to college. I stayed home. I worked the whole time I was in school and medical school, and graduate in 7 years with both of those with zero debt, with a father who was a factory worker and a mother who was a bank teller. So college was very affordable then. You could actually work your way through school. The average medical student, where I taught at Quillen College of Medicine in Johnson City, graduates with $175,000 in debt. That is a huge debt. I think the question is college going to be relevant anymore? And I think it's a question to ask. I think at Western Carolina, and by the way, East Tennessee State beat you guys the other day in basketball. I want to point that out. And I do want to offer my... offer my condolences to you for losing Coach Larry Hunter. I've booed him many times in basketball games, but a great man. In Tennessee, we've decided that education had to be affordable for our citizens. So we put the Tennessee Promise in, and the Tennessee Reconnect. You can now go to community college in our state for free. And I'll just give you a couple little things. At our local TCAT, which is our technical school, at one of them I just saw the other day, 77% finish on time, 97% are placed in a job, and 100% graduate with no debt. So you can go out in our state, and then if you go from community college to a four-year college, East Tennessee State University, Tennessee Tech, Austin Peay, wherever, you have the Hope Scholarship to help you. So we've tried to make it affordable for our students in our state, and I think it's being successful. I really do, and we're paying for that with our lottery scholarship. Another confession: I've served on 2 foundation boards, been the president of one, and I think the college investment is the best investment I ever made, without a doubt. I have not heard any of you all talk about it. I know you know Dr. Zeppos at Vanderbilt University, who complains about the administrative cost, and at Vanderbilt it adds about $10,000 or $11,000. They spend $150 million a year complying with federal mandates and check the box. I heard no one talk about that or didn't see it in your testimony. How much does that at the FAFSA with 100-plus questions and on and on? Could we streamline that for you all and help with the cost a little bit? Because a lot of the reporting doesn't add any value to the students. Anyone can take that question.
That's something I can chime in on. So I think something to think about with administrative costs, we often see people pointing their finger at this as potentially the driver of the rising costs that are getting passed on to students. I think we want to realize that if we were looking at an institution that was providing tremendous outcomes for students and they happen to have large expenditures on administration, we probably wouldn't be questioning whether or not that's an appropriate place for the institution to be doing their spending. What happens inside the school is somewhat of a black box in terms of their finances. I think what we want to be concerned most with is the outcomes that they're producing. The thing that I want to ask is, what is it about the demand side of the equation that's enabling these institutions to drive up their spending because of the increases in revenue that's coming from the increased sticker price and tuition that students are actually charged?
All that Ms. Parker's worried about, it was like when I sent my children to college. All I was interested in when I drew the bottom line was how much of a check do I have to write you all? And that check keeps getting bigger and bigger. And I looked at the inflation rate. I thought we were bad in medicine. We were actually pretty good compared to colleges. Colleges increase their costs almost 8% per year for the last 40 years annually. That's a huge increase. And it is putting college out of the reach of people like Ms. Parker. And you know, I think college is going to have to rethink with all the technology that's on this PDA I've got in my hand right here. I can learn a lot at no cost. So if you look at going to Georgetown, I just pulled it up. I don't want to pick on them, but $75,000 a year. If you then go teach school in Johnson City, Tennessee, that's hardly a return on your investment. Then if you end up being an investment banker in New York, probably is. But you may want to be a teacher. So you're going to have to rethink where you go. And I think another thing we're doing that I think both sides of the aisle do is to educate these young people when they come in about you don't have to borrow the maximum amount of money. You can borrow this much to get along because you're going to have to pay for it sooner or later. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired.
Thank you. The gentleman from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for holding this hearing early in the Congress. Hopefully, this is going to be the year that the 116th Congress reauthorizes the higher ed. It was 2008 was the last time, and we are way overdue for an issue that, again, every part of the country is looking for help and action. First of all, I just wanted to note for, my friend from Tennessee cited the Vanderbilt report. Actually, if you sort of drill down a little bit in terms of the numbers that they used in terms of the $146 million in terms of added costs, most of those regs that they identified were actually had to do with the research component of universities and colleges. And for things on human subjects, which I think all of us would probably agree. That's not a bad idea. So, yeah, that number, which, again, there's a report, I don't dispute that, but the number is actually a little more complicated than I think some of the reporting on it. So I checked this morning, the U.S. Treasury is selling 10-year notes for 2.6%. When I always sort of use that as a benchmark when we talk about the Stafford Student Loan Program, because those are 10-year term notes that the government offers. Again, even today, we're still getting back around 4 to 5% in terms of from students. So that differential, that delta between what the government is paying when it borrows versus what students are paying when they borrow from the same government, it's again, just pure sort of windfall for the federal government. GAO reported that between the years of 2007 and 2012, the federal government had a windfall of about $66 billion in terms of that differential that's there. This morning, myself, along with a lot of my colleagues on this committee, are reintroducing the Bank on Students Emergency Loan Refinancing Bill. Senator Warren is introducing a companion bill in the Senate, which would allow people, both public and private student loans, to write down their interest rate to 3.7%, which was the rate back in 2016. We know from last year's analysis by CBO that would put about $50 billion into the pockets of students and folks who've graduated and who are struggling with student loans. It is not, the panacea, but certainly if you talk to middle-class people who, are trying to lower their monthly expenses, obviously refinancing their home mortgage, car loans, credit card debt. I mean, that is a tool that is normal, but in the student loan market, because it's restricted in the public side by law, and then the private side by the fact that you have to have equity to go in and refinance. You need some other piece of property in terms of writing it down. This is the year we should move forward on that. It's just at least one way of trying to stop the bleeding. And I guess, Dr. Cavall, you talked again about these sort of the horror numbers in terms of default. At least being able to refinance down an interest rate, I think, would provide some mitigation of that problem. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay, and I don't know if anyone would disagree, but I think that would hopefully be the case. Ms. Parker, you talked about your story. Thank you for being here. And I don't mean to, but the private student loan interest rates are far higher than even the inflated Stafford rates. And I maybe just could comment if having that ability to write down the interest rates would be of benefit to you and your friends.
Thank you. Yes, it would be a benefit to myself and my peers. It is.
Congresswoman Shalala is very excited about this bill, obviously. So,
I've accrued now, you said in private.
both private and public can write down to 3%.
I'm at about 66,000 and I have an associate's degree.
Right.
So yes, it would be beneficial to me.
Right. Well, thank you. And I don't know.
I'd agree, and also I'd want to say that the North Carolina Promise is a first dollar plan, whereas other free programs tend to be last dollar and rely on existing aid first. So the North Carolina Promise is actually better and more generous, particularly for low-income students. So, and I think your comment, financial literacy, is something that we also need to be making sure that we're educating our students well.
I guess we're about to run out of time, but again, it was part of the AIM Hire Act last year, and I hope we're very optimistic this is the year to move forward on it. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. This, of course, is an unbelievably important subject for us to be considering, and financial literacy absolutely is something that we have not done well, and we're seeing the challenges of that. Dr. Morrison-Shetler, I often hear that the FAFSA form is a real obstacle to students in continuing their education. I've supported legislation that would allow the IRS to share income information with the Education Department thereby making it easier for students and his families to accurately complete the FAFSA form and access student aid. This policy would also improve accuracy and cut down on the time that student aid administrators spend verifying a family's income. Dr. Morrison-Shetler, has it been your experience at the Western Carolina University that the FAFSA form can act as an obstacle for students? And second, what advice do you have for us to simplify FAFSA in any HEA reauthorization?
I'm in complete agreement that the FAFSA and the protocol to complete the FAFSA is, for some people, an insurmountable position. A lot of our students, particularly at Western Carolina University, are first generation. They come from low-income backgrounds, and when faced with the questions that are on the FAFSA in which they have to remember, or they don't have the information, they just don't do it. And as a result, they don't apply, and therefore they don't go to university or college. And so for my recommendation for all of the federal grants and applications would to simplify them, help people with the process if needed, and we do that at Western Carolina University when people approach us. And so, yes, I would love to see us streamline those compliance, make sure that's streamlined and allows people the opportunity to get the education that they deserve and have earned as their right.
Thank you. Dr. Akers, would you have any addition to that from your experience?
Absolutely, I would endorse simplification of the FAFSA. I think that your initial comments about financial literacy are critically important. Just to cite some evidence from some of my earlier research, we know that through survey data that students are shockingly underinformed about their own financial circumstances. So only about a half of students in their first year of college education know how much they're paying for their degree, and about a third of students are able to accurately tell you how much they've borrowed. So to me, this is a pretty important crisis that we have in higher education finance today.
So a wake-up call of, for instance, Ms. Parker, of $66,000, as you mentioned that. It's amazing. When you first started, did you expect anything like that to be the case in the process?
Not only did I not expect it, I honestly had no idea. The financial literacy piece is a good, it's a big piece because I just wasn't aware. I wasn't informed.
You make the example point very clearly that why we have to move forward on this. Dr. Akers, in your testimony, you note that in some cases, students are spending money on college only end up worse off financially than if they hadn't gone to college in the first place. In looking at the federal student aid system, I'm concerned about perverse incentives to overborrow. Can you expand a bit on what those perverse incentives are and discuss ways we could address them in reauthorization and do it in such a way that I can explain it to my adult children in caring for my grandkids as they come up?
Sure, so the most glaring perverse incentive that exists in the current financial aid regime is that borrowers who anticipate that they'll be eligible for student loan forgiveness at the end of either 10 or 20 years, whether they're in public or private sector, basically face no marginal cost for every additional dollar that they're borrowing. So consider I'm a student at a very high cost institution. I have some understanding of what my career path is going to be after I finish, maybe because I'm in a profession like law or medicine where careers are relatively, or earnings are relatively well known. I may reach a point in my borrowing, if I've been at high-cost institutions, where every additional dollar that I take on in debt to support my lifestyle, for instance, will very likely, or with almost certainty, be forgiven. And so in that case, I have incentive to borrow as much as I'm able to borrow through the federal lending program. What is the solution to this? I think we need to consider limits on the eligibility for loan forgiveness, both in PSLF and income-driven repayment plans like IBR and pay-as-you-earn. Capping those, I think, would diminish that perverse incentive considerably.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Go back.
Gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Fudge.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Ms. Parker from Ohio as well. It's a pleasure to see you and to watch your daughter have such great pride when she hears you speak. Ms. Parker, surely, if we can provide $13 billion to farmers because of the president's bad losing trade war with China, we can help you. Surely, if we can give $1.5 trillion in tax cuts to the wealthiest people in this country, surely we should be able to help you. And some of those very people we've just seen in the news cheat to get their children in college, and you have done it the hard way. So I am confident that you are going to be successful. I am confident that you are going to see your way out of poverty because you have worked hard, you are committed, and a lot of these cheaters are not. So be confident, just claim that, all right? Because you're going to be successful. Dr. Quall, do you think that it is important for us to discuss loan forgiveness as we talk about income-driven repayment plans?
I do.
And what should that be? What should that discussion be like?
Well, my view is that students who are paying everything they're supposed to pay over a period of 20 years should at that point in time have the opportunity to have the rest of their student loan forgiven. 20 years is a very long time. We know that student debt affects your credit score and makes it difficult to save for mortgage. After 20 years, you may be trying to save for your children's education. And I think there's an opportunity there where we need to say that we've collected what we can collect from this.
So is there something we can do in a shorter period of 20 years to help somebody like Ms. Parker?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that people that should qualify for special help. I think one is people who go into public service careers. And we know that student debt is an obstacle and does affect career choices, and that can make it a challenge to recruit people into the military, into teaching careers. It impacts the diversity of those public service workforces. I think a second category is people who have been cheated by their colleges, and there are currently over 100,000 borrowers who have applications pending at the education department claiming fraud or some other illegal conduct at their college. Those people need to have their loans forgiven as well.
Thank you. Just one more question for you, Dr. Quall. Grad Plus loans. How do you believe that Grad Plus loans assist with students in underrepresented communities, or even fields for that matter, can get to graduate school? And what effect would there be if we eliminated them altogether?
Well, Graduate Plus loans are an important source of finance for many people pursuing graduate and professional degrees, especially people whose families are low in wealth, including communities of color. And we expanded access to federal loans for these communities because we were concerned that otherwise they would borrow higher cost private loans that have interest rates that can be as high as 13 or 14%.
Dr. Morrison-Shetlar, since you represent a university that deals with a lot of first-time and low-income students, what do you think we should be looking at to try to reduce the ongoing and sometimes just exorbitant rate of loans that people have to take out? What do you think we should be doing differently? Is it increasing Pell Grants? Is it doing, just give me your ideas.
I certainly would approve of reducing the cost to a student to be able to attend and attain their dream of an education. There are a lot of grants, as we heard, loans out there. I would like to see those simplified in terms of applications, and more investment in those Pell Grants is a really good example. With over 40% Pell eligible students at Western Carolina University, we could see a tremendous amount of reduction in indebtedness with all of the results that occurs from that. People graduating on time, not having to do 3 or 4 jobs to be able to make it through, which distracts from their time of really focusing on their education and their future careers. So I'd like to see what we're currently doing expanded and make sure that it's easy and relevant to be able to apply for those opportunities.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to close again with Ms. Parker. You know, we live in a country where people say if you work hard, you'll be successful and you'll do well. I want you to know that those people who believe people like you are lazy, you are a perfect example of someone who is not. I wish you all the very best. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding time, and thank you for the panelists for being here today. This is an important hearing, and I appreciate the chairman for calling it. So, Dr. Akers, according to a study by the Brookings Institute, only a quarter of first-year students could accurately report how much they had borrowed, and 14% of students who had borrowed money thought they had no debt at all. This information problem is very concerning to me, which is why I have introduced a bipartisan counseling bill with my friend Congressman Bonamici from Oregon in the last 3 Congresses to enhance financial aid awareness and understanding. The bill would require more detailed and annual counseling for federal aid recipients throughout their education. Can you discuss the benefits of counseling students on their financial aid?
Sure. So a lot of folks are looking into the fact that the provision of information about the cost that students are facing and the aid that they're receiving is unnecessarily difficult to digest. So the students were discussed just recently are receiving right now their acceptance letters to universities and also their financial aid award packages. These packages are not often completely transparent about the difference between loans and grants, and I think this is leaving students questioning what exactly their financial circumstances are. Obviously, it's leaving them questioning that because we were able to document that using survey data. So if we want students to be able to police the market for higher education using their dollars that it's choosing to spend at institutions that are delivering good outcomes for students, they need to understand what it is they're paying. They need to understand what it is they're borrowing. We also, of course, want them to understand what it is that institutions are delivering to students that they've served previously. So I think it's critically important to the system and also just to individual students themselves.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Weber, with $1.4 trillion in outstanding federal loan debt, there is no doubt that students are struggling with student debt. In your testimony, you noted the large amount of misinformation on who is suffering the most from taking on loan debt. Can you please explain what level of education students with $60,000 or more debt are seeking compared to the average balance of defaulted loans?
Sure. On average, the typical student who has more than, say, $100,000 in debt, first, they're very rare. We're talking about 5% of borrowers. Most of them are people who have gone to graduate school, received professional degrees, med school that are going to pay off in spades. Not all of them, and I don't want to minimize the problems that that some have, but it is somewhat of a distraction from the much larger problem of people who have, say, between $5,000 and $10,000 in debt, but did not graduate, attended a low-value institution, an under-resourced institution, and because the vast majority of the college premium is tied up in actually getting the degree, then having $5,000 or $10,000 in debt, which is not dischargeable in bankruptcy, you're going to be much more likely to default under that scenario than someone with a graduate or professional degree and much more debt.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Morrison-Shetler, I was interested in your testimony about the partnership with regional community colleges. And could you elaborate on this? I know in Kentucky, a lot of people are getting their 2-year degree and then moving on. They matriculate straight into our 4-year universities with transferring credit. And when I was in the state legislature, I worked with someone to do dual credit. And we actually have people graduating from high school with their associate's degree if they want to move forward, essentially with no debt. I think there's some cost to it, but it's not typically if they graduated from high school and went. So could you explain what you guys are doing to keep college costs down by working with community colleges?
Most certainly. The great thing about Western Carolina University is that we work with all of our community colleges. We set up MOUs through particular tracks of education so that students, when they go to the community college, know what they need to take at the community college that will count towards their 4-year degree, should they choose to go on and do that. And so we work very closely with the presidents and with the admissions office and with the advising office, which I think is a key component to anyone transferring from one institution to another. At Western, we have 42% of our students are transfer students, and we make sure that the curriculum alignment is in place, and that also the advising that they're getting at the community college is in affiliation with that at Western Carolina University. So a seamless transfer is really, really important. Curriculum alignment is really, really important.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody for being here and the chairman for calling this meeting. My time's expired, so I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mrs. Sablon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Good morning to all the panelists. Welcome, Journey. I hope that you will remember forever this moment in your life and how your mother is sharing her story with us, because that story has you as a part in it, a major part. I'd also like to take an opportunity, the privilege to recognize in the audience a student from the Northern Marianas who is attending school here in Washington, D.C., Olivia. So your name's in the record for good. She doesn't like that, but anyway. I come from a place where we have a community college, a two-year college. 90% of our students qualify for a Pell Grant. And when I went to college, I had to come here as a foreign student. My father had a family of 7 children to raise. He was making $1.25 an hour, and he lost his job. I couldn't just go and get a job because I needed to get immigration to approve it as well. So it wasn't easy for me to finish college, to be very honest. Ms. Parker, congratulations. I mean, you're in my prayers too. You will succeed also, I agree with. But Chancellor Morrison Shetler, you may not know this, but again, my district in the Northern Marianas and American Samoa are the only 2 U.S. jurisdictions without a 4-year public university. Each hosts a single community college. Our students face the cost of non-resident tuition at 4-year institutions, as well as the extra travel cost to attend school in Hawaii, 4,000 miles away from home, or almost 8,000 miles away from your school. As a member of this committee, I've worked and I continue to work on legislation to help reduce the cost for my constituents. I must compliment your state for committing the resources to be able to make college affordable and also make sure the students are nurtured too. I will submit my questions for the record, but as a university chancellor, do you believe the federal government has a role to play in assisting students with unique college costs, such as those from the Marianas and American Samoa?
The federal government has a number of things in place, and as I mentioned earlier, I think the way to help people is to make sure that those grants and loans that are available are able to be easily attained. In North Carolina, we subsidize the in-state students of the $500 per semester. We also have a $2,500 for out-of-state. But we also have an 18% cap on the number of out-of-state students that we can take into North Carolina.
Yes.
And I think that's something that one has to be aware of when we're funding the students in North Carolina. I will say that we are very fortunate at Western Carolina University, and within the system, actually, 50% of the students who come from out of state to North Carolina end up staying in the state of North Carolina. And so that is a great investment in North Carolina and allows people to give back to the economy within North Carolina.
Right, thank you. And for me, we prefer that you educate our students and then they come back home and use what they learn. But Ms. Parker, college students in the Marianas and across the country are juggling work, parenting, and school. In fact, 1 in 4 students nationwide are parents. More than 1 in 3 are older than 25, and almost 2 out of 3 work while in college. So what supports made it easier for you to remain in college, persist?
Thank you. Thank you for your wishes earlier. I've been connected to resources, and that's what's been able to get me to completion. For example, the biggest help, I would say, was being connected to the Jobs and Family Services representative on campus. I went to visit the representative for child care costs. I needed help getting child care costs to be approved while I was in school, and Journey was at daycare at the time. When I went to speak to the Job and Family Services representative, she also let me know that I could enroll for additional benefits, so the health care, the food stamps, and then I was also referred to in that same department, not through her specifically, but to Scholar House for the student parent housing. It takes a platform of all of those put together for me to be able to get to completion.
Thank you. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, my time is up. Will submit questions for the record. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for this hearing. It's important to find out what is actually got us to this point and then try to fix it. It's a difficult situation. We've got 7.4 million jobs open in this country right now. We got college graduates that can't get a job. I cannot, for the life of me, understand that. And everywhere I go, people need people. And it's not necessarily a college graduate, it's skilled people. And of course, the chairman put up a chart up there about the difference in the wages of college graduates versus those who maybe have technical training and all that. That gap, in my opinion, is narrowing very quickly. I know that when I was in college, I had the opportunity to learn how to weld. And through that skill, I was going to co-op, and through that skill and working basically double time and help from my parents, I was able to get through it. Of course, I thought it was terribly expensive back then, and I'm sure I missed out on some of the college experience, but I had no college debt thanks to my great family and their support. So I can't imagine, Ms. Parker, what you've been through. And also to straighten out one other thing that came up here today, and I just have to do this, is that I did notice that you were on the Food Safety Nutrition Program. One of my colleagues brought up the Farm Bill. 80% of the Farm Bill is funding the safety net nutrition programs. It's not greedy farmers. We're just trying to keep our farmers in business so we can produce the best, safest, most efficient food supply. It's a national security issue, actually. So since you're here and you're learning from us and we're learning from you, I thought you probably needed to know that. So with that, Dr. Akers, your testimony mentions ways to bring private capital back into the student loan space, increase a competitive market participation in student lending, and can you expand on those issues and discuss any challenges policymakers should think about while considering private sector participation in student lending?
Sure. Is the question about private sector participation in provision of education or in the financing?
Well, in the financing. For example, we were told that the student loan rate is somewhere between 7% and 8%, and I know that, I come from the business world, and we borrow money for much less than that. Now, obviously, you might have to get, like a small business government-backed loan, but at least you could reduce the interest rate substantially and provide where Ms. Parker could go and say, well, the government's charging me this, and you're going to charge me. Give her choices, and also the financial institutions, I think, would do a much better job. At least I have to do a portfolio and tell them how I'm going to have to pay the money back. Maybe they could educate Ms. Parker on how to really pay that money back.
Sure. So there's a bit of a misconception about the idea that private sector capital was previously involved in the federal student lending program. So depending on how long you've been involved in this issue, we previously were providing federal student loans through the FEL program, in which the loans were originated and financed by the private sector, but those loans were originated using terms that were prescribed by legislation. So in essence, Department of Education was outsourcing to the private market the creation of those loans. Those loans were not private sector or private loans in any broader sense because they were not underwritten. So what you're talking about is the process by which a private lender looks at a particular borrower and assesses their ability to repay in the future. That does not happen in the federal lending program for student borrowers and did not happen even when private capital were involved. The way forward to think about private capital in higher education finance, I believe, is in the realm of income share agreements. So income share agreements are a relatively newly employed mechanism that are an alternative to loans that can help borrowers finance their education. So rather than taking out a loan and having fixed payments to repay over 10 years, or whatever the term of the loan is, a borrower takes cash up front in exchange for a promise to pay a fraction of their income over a set period of time. And so this provides an insurance policy for students that if they face low income or no income for whatever reason, they're not on the hook for an unaffordable financial obligation. And it also puts some skin in the game for institutions. So in thinking about private capital going forward, I think that's the place to focus attention.
Well, again, I had an amendment on the past bill markup to somehow put financial, actually education into the student loan program. So, like folks like Mrs. Parker would understand, what she's up against. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Fox, for holding this hearing. Thank you to all of our witnesses, Ms. Parker and Journey. Especially thank you to you for being here and telling your story and reminding us that the costs of higher education are not just about tuition, housing, childcare. There's so many other costs as well. I also worked my way through. I started at 2 years of community college, then 2 years of college, 3 years of law school with a combination of grants, loans, and work study, and ended up, because it was a long time ago, with a manageable amount of debt. And my first job was with the federal government, not with the law firm where I could have made more money. And unfortunately, that's not the story I hear frequently today. So I'm really glad that we're having this hearing, especially when we're talking about students who remain underrepresented. But I'm also glad that there seems to be a general recognition about the importance of higher education among people here today. We certainly need a short-term solution for people like Ms. Parker with existing debt, but we also need long-term solutions to make sure that anyone who wants to go to college can do so without being burdened with debt. Mr. Quall, nice to see you. The Federal Work Study Program allows students to get work study experience and financial aid. And I have introduced the Opportunities for Success Act to reform the Federal Work Study Program, to modernize the funding formula, which has not been done for quite some time, and also to make sure that work is going to, the work study jobs are helping to align students' work with their career goals and interests. We want the aid to go to the students most in need. So what are your suggestions about how to make sure that institutions are serving the largest number of low-income students and helping to align their interests with their work-study jobs?
Ms. Bonamici, thank you for the question. I share your support for the work-study program. Work is an important strategy for getting students through college, both because it fills important gaps in financial aid budgets, but also research shows that modest amounts of work can actually help retain students and give them an opportunity to explore career interests and improve their earnings potential after college. The challenge we have, though, is many students are in the same low-wage workforce as other low-income Americans, and we know those jobs are very unstable, can be difficult to get schedules. So to have an opportunity for a work-study program where jobs are designed around schedules of students, they're often on campus, they're connected to career and academic interests, is very valuable. The existing work-study program funds colleges largely historically, and it no longer sends the money where there are large numbers of low-income students. So, for example, New York University gets a larger allocation than CUNY does. In fact, if you're a low-income student at a 4-year private university, you're more likely to get work study than a low-income student at a public university, even though we know public universities disproportionately enroll low-income students. So I think.
And I want to get another couple questions in, but
I
I think the
apologize.
message that it's time to update the funding formula. Thank you also for mentioning my Simple Act that I've been working on. I plan to reintroduce this bill, which will protect many borrowers from default by getting more students and keeping more students in income-driven repayment. And you mentioned the importance of automating the annual income recertification process and also automatically enrolling severely delinquent borrowers. These are both changes in this Simple Act. Can you talk a little bit about how this will help students?
Yes, the income-driven repayment is a really important safety net. It allows us to tell students we think loans are an excellent investment, but if it doesn't pay off, we can guarantee that loan payments will be affordable. There are very important changes that need to be made to the program to simplify the program for students, make it easier to enroll, auto-enroll delinquent students. And so I think the Simple Act has a lot of potential to reduce loan delinquency and default and make a real difference.
Thank you so much. And I also heard retention several times this morning. And that's a significant issue, especially if we look at the students with debt. If they don't graduate, they're much less likely to be able to pay that back. So who wants to talk about the importance of Gear Up and TRIO and programs that help with retention? Dr. Morrison-Shaler.
All of those programs help with retention, and it's key that if you have students who have debt, that you get them through the process and you get them to a point where they can start to work and earn money and pay back those debts. And those programs that you're talking about are essential. They include things like financial literacy. They include things like working, if you're going to work in something that will get you the experience that will help you to succeed in your career. So there are career pathway experiences. And so all of those things help with retention. And just making sure that students can focus on their studies and get their work done without having to work on 2 or 3 jobs really, really is important. So any program that will help students be able to focus and get through their degrees and be successful, I'm fully supportive of.
Thank you. And over time, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for Dr. Schattler. I'd like to learn just a little bit more about your transfer program, which helps students prepare for several high-demand career fields that you described. How did you determine what jobs are in high demand in the workforce?
Within Western North Carolina, we do surveys. We look to see what jobs are available, in particular, what jobs are needed. And so in our particular area, healthcare is a big industry and one in which we are severely need for the citizens of Western North Carolina. And so we make sure as an institution that we are providing the right programs with the right qualifications and the right experiences so that students will then graduate and then go into those careers and be successful. And that lifts up the whole economic development of our region.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about the agreements that you have in place with some of the partner colleges? Was it difficult to reach those agreements, or talk a little bit about how that came about?
Well, we all have the same goal in mind for our students to be successful, and to do that, we need to make sure that we have curriculum alignment. If you're taking 2 years of community college and earning your AA degree, then those credits transfer into your 4-year degree, and then you can go through as seamlessly as possible. Advising is really key on that, so we do joint advising between the community colleges and the university, making sure that the advisors know what to say to the students if they even are thinking about going to a 4-year degree. Because a lot of students go to community colleges not thinking that they're even going to have that dream. And so advising is a real component. And then making sure that those memorandums of understanding between the colleges and the universities are clear and updated regularly as curriculum changes to meet the needs of a growing industry like healthcare.
Yeah. In your mind, what could other regions learn from you? What obstacles would they have to setting up similar arrangements?
It's all about communication. It's all about the best for the student and making sure that that pathway is one that is affordable. And this is where NC Promise, I think, has been fabulous, because the cost of NC Promise to the student can be similar to a community college cost. And therefore, if a student has managed to get through the 2 years and with the cost of that, to be able to transfer to Western Carolina University, for example, as an NC Promise school, means that they're already on that pathway. They know that they can afford it. They know how much debt they're going to incur, and they know that they're going to get a high-quality education provided by high-quality faculty and staff who make sure that they have the experiences that they need to be successful.
Thank you. Dr. Akers, innovation in any industry is critical to increasing competition amongst providers and delivering a high-quality product to consumers at a low price. And it appears that colleges and universities, we know education is changing, but in some ways continue to use the same model that's been in existence for a long, long time, for decades and maybe longer. How can we be helpful, or maybe to what extent do you think the federal government sort of constrains what colleges and universities can do? How can we work with you to encourage more innovation in higher education?
Sure. So in order for a new institution to come into existence, they need to be able to find and retain students. It's challenging for them to do that in the current space because they're competing with institutions who have eligibility for very generous aid through the Pell Grant program and access to subsidized student loans. The way to potentially allow them access to federal student aid is through the Experimental Sites Initiative and the EQUIP program. So this is an effort that was started under the Obama administration to allow innovative institutions that don't fit the standard model of what higher education looks like in this country, and therefore don't achieve the standards that are necessary to gain access to financial aid. It allowed them to partner with traditional institutions and to sort of play with federal student aid and experiment. That effort was not largely successful, perhaps because of the way it was designed. I'd encourage that the federal government continue to support those types of initiatives that don't just open the floodgates and allow federal student aid to be utilized by these new and exciting business models without any accountability, but rather to continue to test out and using different sites and trial programs for these new programs that have a proven track record of success.
Great. My time, I look forward to working with you on that, but my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do appreciate that you're holding hearings on this important topic. I want to thank all of the panelists for being here today, but I want to begin my question with Mr. Quall. It's good to see you again, and thank you for being here to share your recommendations on improving college affordability. I have a letter from Chancellor Oakley of the California Community Colleges that describes how the California Community Colleges have been hit hard, particularly by the for-profit closures in the state of California. And so what happens is when for-profit companies suddenly shutter, the community colleges, which are already under-resourced, how they mobilize to provide support to effective students. So without objection, I'd like to enter this into the record. The ability of the community colleges to properly serve these students is severely hampered by the poor quality education, that the students receive at the for-profit institution, and by the debt load students carry after attending one of these schools. I've heard too many stories about students attempting to transfer their credits, only to find out that almost none of their credits actually transferred, and that they're nearing the maximum, their maximum loan limit, impeding them to continue their education, in this case at community colleges. So, Mr. Quall, what can the federal government do to provide better upfront accountability of for-profit institutions to better protect students?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Takano. We have seen over the last few years for-profit colleges enrolling over 100,000 students close and leave them in the bind. So the instances you mentioned in California are only the latest in a long chain that began with Corinthian. It is important to have strong accountability protections, such as the gainful employment rule, which requires that typical graduates of for-profit programs be able to repay their loans. The borrower defense rule, which holds colleges accountable for illegal conduct, such as fraud. the incentive compensation rule, which prohibits deceptive and high-pressure recruiting, and the 90-10 rule, which requires at least 10% of students being willing to pay for the education out of their own pocket. So there are important accountability rules. Many of them are being neglected by the current administration, and others need to be strengthened by Congress.
Yeah, I'm aware of the neglect and actually the rollback of protections. And I understand in the chairman's Aim Higher Act that we actually work to strengthen some of the protections you mentioned. How do we ensure that students aren't left with burdensome debt after a for-profit closure?
Well, one important step is to make sure that students have their loans discharged after a school closes. Current law gives them the right to choose whether to transfer or get their loans discharged. Many students never actually do either, so it's important to guarantee them that automatic right to have the school discharged. We need to adequately fund tuition relief funds so that students have that means. And we also shouldn't keep students in the dark. So, you know, when the Argosy College and these other colleges closed last week, it wasn't a surprise to the executives at those colleges. It wasn't a surprise to the Department of Education, but it was a surprise to a lot of the students who were borrowing and dipping into their savings to go to those schools.
That's amazing. I want to talk about income share agreements, or ISAs, that are contracts between college students and investors in which an investor agrees to pay a portion of a student's tuition for a portion of the student's future income after graduation. Speaking frankly, I see ISAs as another way to push the private market onto students, which has never resulted in positive outcomes. In an effort to shore up profits, the private market has been inclined to irresponsible and unfair practices when lending to vulnerable students, which is what led us to include consumer protections in the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010. Given the history of the private market in college financing, I'm concerned with the potential abuse of students through ISAs. Mr. Qual, what are some of the other pitfalls of ISAs?
Well, I share your concerns, Mr. Takano. I think that private loans, including ISAs, will always have higher costs and weaker consumer safeguards than federal student loans do. ISAs in particular are not transparent. And because students have very different earning trajectories, sometimes because of labor market discrimination, ISAs have the potential to have higher costs for some types of students and even exclude some students from some types of programs or colleges.
Well, my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. Gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Watkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. So I represent Eastern Kansas. It's agrarian, and there's lots of poverty issues there. And I know personally what it's like to try and deal with mounting school debt. So it seems to me the solution was a pro-economic growth policy characterized by low taxes and low regulation that allows the economy to thrive. And does it work? Well, our pro-growth economic policy has led to record low unemployment. We're enjoying over 7 million job openings. The Labor Department, when reporting on hiring competition, says that there's an increase in average hourly pay by 3.4% from last year, which is the highest in a decade. Given the strong economy, Dr. Akers, are you seeing states beginning to thoughtfully reinvest into their higher education institutions, given the strong economic performance nationally?
Yeah, it does seem that there was a decline in state support of higher education following the Great Recession, and we have seen recent indications of an increase in investment.
Thank you, Doctor. Chancellor Morrison-Shetler, staying with the excessive red tape subject, would you speak to any burdensome federal regulations on the higher education community that could be cut so that you can spend more focus on students and education?
One of the main issues that we have is just the cost of compliance, meeting the compliance regulations and needs. It would be great if we could either keep the amount of compliance that we have to report on, or decrease it. That would certainly help us with the burden of that, because we're actually having to hire people to be able to help us with that, rather than using those resources to invest in education.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chancellor. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you. The Gentlelady from North Carolina, Dr. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looked like there was some extra time on there. Let me thank all of you, first of all, for being here and for your testimony. Ms. Parker, I am very moved by your story. I am a retired professor of 40 years at Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, where I work with young women, just like you. I went to school like you and took my children with me, and I know the struggle. But of course, when I was in school many, many years ago, the cost was not nearly what it is today. Dr. Morrison, thank you for what you do for our students in North Carolina. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record a letter from CLASP, an organization that supports low-income students.
Without objection.
Thank you. Let me ask, first of all, Chancellor Morrison Settler, you helped create the North Carolina Promise Program. I was a member of the North Carolina House. When that discussion came up, I was a little concerned as well about not only the fact, I think we always need to try to make college affordable. Access and affordability really are key for students. Having worked at a private institution, knowing a lot about our historically black colleges and universities in North Carolina, I had a concern about the costs that the college would incur. And with $500 that the students pay, do you have any information about, I know Elizabeth City is one of the schools there, fine university. I had an opportunity to talk with the chancellor, but I'm curious about that. And I know how it's a game changer for students, but in terms of the struggle for universities.
This is a very ambitious program, and the state has stepped forward, and this first year alone, $51 million have been put towards the success of this program. And so the universities are subsidized and given the money by the state to make sure that there is no impact on the quality of the education that the institutions are able to provide.
Mm-hmm. I also know that, with the universities, and this is supposed to be for 3 years for the students, is that correct?
No, it's for the students, it's the time of the whole time that they're in the university.
Oh, okay. I was trying to figure that out. Let me ask, what considerations did you give in terms of helping to get this program started?
As soon as we heard about it, we wanted to work very closely with our legislators to make sure that it was functional for the universities and most importantly, that it was something that was transformational for our students. To have, particularly Western North Carolina, we have a lot of low-income students. We're a very rural area. The other two institutions are also in rural areas. We wanted to make sure that the right people were able to access this kind of program.
Okay.
And so the ability to let people know that this was available to them, that an education was available to them was important.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Koval, this hearing has focused a lot of attention on hardships of students of color and what they face in terms of the student aid space. Our nation's minority-serving institutions provide a quality education to a sizable portion of black and brown students and do so at a fraction of the cost of most flagship public universities. But despite the fact of what I just said, the president's budget level funds Title III and V and allows important mandatory funds to expire. In your opinion, if we were to increase federal investment in our nation's MSIs, is it your thinking that we could close some of the gaps in terms of access, affordability, and completion among students of color compared to their counterparts?
Yes, we know those institutions get much less funding per student, and it's not a surprise that that's one reason why their graduation rates are not as high as some other institutions.
Okay, one quick question, and I think maybe Dr. Akers spoke to this in terms of the student understanding the financial aid packages. What can we do to help them better understand it? And if we can get Ms. Parker to make a quick response too, because she commented about that as well.
I think that it's important that specifically when students are going from high school to college to also educate their parents, because if you're talking about students from low economic backgrounds, it's a generational effect. It's something that is happening before it even got to that one student.
Okay.
I think that higher education is an incredibly complex product, and so while I hate to have a recommendation for a heavy-handed approach about how institutions should be delivering their financial aid award letters, I think it's justified that we direct some sort of standardization in the provision of that information to students.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from excuse me, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for your testimony today. And Dr. Morrison Stetler, what you described is very similar that North Carolina is doing, and I want to compliment your state, is similar to what the university in my district has done, the University of Texas at Arlington. It's 55,000 students, including online courses. It's the fastest growing campus in the UT system, which is a very large system in Texas, and is second only to Austin. But here's the interesting thing. It has the lowest average debt per graduating student of any college or university, private or public, in Texas, and one of the lowest in the United States. The average is like $14,700 of debt. And one of the things they did is similar to what you talked about in terms of partnerships with community colleges. But they did something really, what I think is special, and I wanted you to comment on this, because the president of the university, the president of the community college, the school superintendents in the area came together, and in order to try and lower that cost for the students, the high school students can go to the community college and take courses and get college credit, which when they get to UT Arlington is then recognized and accepted by the university. And a lot of students are taking advantage of that. Can you speak to that in terms of your experience? Do y'all engage the high schools in North Carolina to any degree?
I can't speak directly to what the schools do directly with the community colleges, but the idea is absolutely fabulous, and in any way that we can make sure that students have a seamless transfer from the K through 16 is really, really a great thing to be thinking about. So I'd like to learn more about it.
Great. And I yield the rest of my time back to Dr. Fox.
Thank you very much. Dr. Weber, you discussed non-completion in your testimony and call it the biggest risk associated with going to college. Are you familiar with the revenue theory thesis where institutions are spending on faculty prestige and influence instead of on support services to help students graduate? I'm particularly interested in your opinion on the effects highly priced academic programs have on perceived educational quality and student access.
Well, thank you for the question. It's very important. First, I'd say that there's mixed evidence as to the impact of very highly priced educational programs. Certainly, there are impacts of truly increased college quality. There are large earnings impacts from, say, going to a high-quality state flagship university versus a regional comprehensive. For any number of reasons. I do not think that there is strong evidence to suggest that these so-called fancy universities, the very highly priced private institutions, that there's a causal effect of higher earnings or anything from those.
I'm interested in the existing research behind the trends in the value proposition of college. We've all heard college graduate earnings outpace peers who attain a high school education. However, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, the economic return on college is unequal across the population and diminishing across successive generations of college graduates. Dr. Akers, what can we do to restore the return on investment to higher education and make the prospect of college less risky?
So there's a vast body of evidence estimating very large positive returns to higher education. Of course, there is a dispersion of what those returns are across different classes of students, particularly with respect to their families' wealth. I think the most important thing to consider in maintaining the value that we have seen historically in higher education is ensuring that prices don't continue to creep up at the rate that they have been growing. I believe that the most important tool we have for doing that is empowering consumers with information so that they can make informed choices about where to spend. To the extent that they understand where spending is worth it and where it isn't, they can put pressure on the institutions themselves to keep price in line with value.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Wright.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Chairman Scott, for holding this very critical hearing. Ms. Parker, your story is my story. You are me. So everything that you said resonates with me, and I am so incredibly familiar with the idea of going through community college and working 3 jobs because this is my experience. I will disagree with you on one thing. You said the odds are that you will not lift yourself out of poverty. You already are lifting yourself out of poverty, so I hope you know that. Again, I could take the whole 5 minutes because this is so deeply personal to me, but 2 things I want to first clarify. This idea that graduate debt is a choice, I have to push back on that. All I ever wanted to be was a teacher. I went to community college, went back and got a bachelor's degree. In order to be an entry-level teacher and maintain Connecticut certification, you have to obtain a master's degree within your first 5 years and then professional certification. So in order for me to get an entry-level job, I needed a postgraduate degree. So it's not a choice. And then the other thing that I could feel the energy coming off of you when the comment was made that we could find other jobs, maybe welding or career training. I was told the same thing 15 years ago, and I went and became a certified nurse's aide, and I worked my way through school. But my question then and my question is now is exactly the same. Don't I get to dream? Don't I get to have aspirations? Don't I get to provide a professional future for my children? So I, on purpose, chose professors that would allow me to bring my kids to class. I, on purpose, did those things. And what I will tell you, Ms. Parker, is that in the space of 7 years, I went from being the first person in my family to ever graduate from college to being a second-generation college-educated family because from my daughter, she saw me every day going to school, and it was never an option. And she went to college, and she, too, is a teacher now. So if you ever question what this means and why it's important, your daughter is seeing through you what the possibility is, and you do get to dream. So my question, I guess, is for Chancellor Morrison-Shetler. When we're talking about eliminating programs like the Federal Supplemental Opportunity Grants, or TRIO, or Gear Up, are those programs directly attacking low-income families, in your opinion? Because one of the things I was told when I couldn't get a loan or a grant was to have my mother or my family fill out a PLUS loan or a parent loan. If I'm already working 3 jobs and helping to take care of my family, my mother didn't have the capacity to fill out a loan on my behalf. So it just perpetuates this idea of generational poverty. It says if you already don't have it, you can't have access to it. So is the elimination of these programs, in your opinion, a direct attack on low-income families?
I think the problem is exactly as you mentioned it. Anything that prevents people from being able to apply for any aid or support at all is attack on student learning and the ability to progress in their careers. And that's why I'm so proud of what North Carolina is doing in terms of capping things like 3% cap on fees, making sure that we've got state investment in the cost of attendance for students. So any program that puts barriers towards people applying for support to be educated, I think is attacking student learning.
Thank you. And then for the remainder of my time, Ms. Parker, Actually, you figured it out a lot sooner than I did. My children were older than Journey when I decided to go back to community college, but I still would have to create opportunities for childcare and to bring them to class to do different things. What do you think would happen to other students if programs like the childcare access and childcare that currently exists were further eliminated?
Thank you. First of all, thank you. I think it would give us, when I say as student parents, the opportunity to move forward and progress, and like you said, break through generational barriers that have been placed upon us. I think that if I know that there's a safe place for my child while I'm in class, I would have the bandwidth to focus more on what my studies are. Thank you. Thank you.
It's my time, or no time. Sorry.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Sure. We've heard that part of the reason for the increase in tuition is there's a lessening of government support for the schools, and they have to make it up in tuition. But I think you said that was 30% of the upper. Tuition has gone up dramatically, though, even without that. To what do you attribute that, or how are we spending more money today compared to 30 years ago for an equivalent degree? Where's that cash going?
I'll take this. The numbers are about 30% is due to state divestments since the year 2000, since the beginning of the Great Recession in 2007. It's about 41% state divestment is responsible for. There are, across sectors, many different reasons. I mentioned the competition with the private sector salaries, that in order to hire a highly trained professor, universities have to compete with the private sector. One thing that is often mentioned is so-called wasteful spending at universities. This is really concentrated only among the universities that the Harvard's, this amenity spending is concentrated among a small set of universities that
Harvard is more wasteful than the other universities. That's what you're telling us. We shouldn't take the waste of Harvard University as being typical.
I guess what I'm saying is that the universities that make the New York Times for the lazy rivers, so to speak, educate a very, very small percentage of the students in this country, and are not at all representative of where most people are being educated.
Okay, kind of give you a follow-up question there. One of the faculty members of my universities, they felt that over time, not research personnel, but there had been, say over the last 30, 40 years, a significant increase in non-teaching personnel at the universities, and that's why the students are being pounded for this high tuition. Has there been a significant increase in non-teaching personnel over the last 40 years?
There has, and I would say that there's, this is in part, this is some student-centered spending, that, there are services to students that are not being offered, necessary services that are being offered now that were not being offered, decades ago, that help students, especially, first-generation students, graduate.
Okay. Question for you. I think there's a feeling over time that sometimes people take out more student loans than are necessary. I do think it's a good idea to rank universities as to how their students are doing on student loans. But do you think if we're going to begin to do that, or the rankings are going to begin to appear, if we should allow the universities themselves some say into how much loans the students are taking out? And I think there is a feeling among some professionals, that, and this was true when I went to school like 40 years ago, that sometimes people take out more loans than are necessary to a certain extent to support a lifestyle. Would you be in favor of universities saying you'd have to have the university sign up before you got a loan?
I am very in favor of more accountability, and I'm also in favor of this proposal.
Good. That's great. One other thing, we talk about, loan or Pell Grants for, certain demographics. Frequently people from, say, middle-class homes or kids from married families, they may not be getting a lot from their parents, but you could argue, and I've had parents complain about this, that some people who live one lifestyle are more likely to get grants than people who live another lifestyle. Do you think that's perhaps unfair?
I do think that's unfair. I think that it's easy to focus on anecdotes of, this person is getting something that, maybe they quote unquote don't deserve. I don't think that that's representative of the general situation.
People getting penalized for getting married, for example, that sort of thing, or having married parents. Is that? Do you think that's unfair? We'll ask Ms. Shetler. Do you think that's unfair?
I think individuals come to university or college with different backgrounds and different support mechanisms. I'm first generation and come from a modest background, and was grateful for the grants and loans that were available to me. And so I think it's hard to sort of paint everyone with one brush stroke. I think it's often an individual choice in some cases, but sometimes a set of circumstances that occurs.
So you're in favor of discrimination, or?
I am not in favor of discrimination.
Okay.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Gentleman from California, Mr. Harder.
Thank you so much all for being here on such an important subject. Dr. Kual, I'd love to start with you. Can you share with us once again what the aggregate amount of student debt is now in the United States?
$1.5 trillion.
And I know I haven't been here that long. It wasn't that long ago since I was in college myself. When I was in college in 2006, do you recall where the aggregate debt was then?
I don't, but it was substantially less than $1 trillion.
I think it was around about $500 billion. Does that sound about right?
It does.
So in other words, in the last 10 years since I got out of school, the aggregate amount of student debt in this country has tripled in the last 10 years. Is that fair?
Yes.
And while we've done that, I think it's interesting to note that we've also been disinvesting at the same time in some of the federal support services that are really critical. So in 1980, my belief is, or my understanding is that the Pell Grant covered, the maximum Pell Grant was about 76% of the cost of attendance for a four-year school, about 76% in 1980. Is that around correct? Do you know where it is today?
It is about a quarter.
Got it. So, in other words, the amount of student debt has tripled over the last 10 years, and over the last 30 years or so, we've gone from, about 40 years, we've gone from about 76% of the cost of attendance of a Pell Grant has slipped to about a quarter. Is that fair?
That's right.
And I'd love to get the student perspective on this as well, Ms. Parker, and thank you so much for being here. It's interesting day to day because we're about 24 hours after a real scandal in higher education, where we've seen, I think, a renewed sense of the inequality in our higher education system. To your belief, did your parents bribe any school administrators or coaches to get you into school?
No.
You sure there's no endowed building, a couple $1 million that helped get you into Franklin?
I guarantee you there is not.
There isn't in my alma mater either. And what did you study when you were in school?
This most recent time?
Yeah.
Human resource management.
And before you decided to study that, did you have access to reliable data that told you this is what you're going to make after 4 years of a program of study?
If I had access to the data, it was not something that I had background knowledge of knowing to do.
Got it. Would that have been helpful in making a decision about what to study?
Yes.
And Mr. Kjell, would you agree that students today applying to college don't necessarily have the information that they need to enroll in school?
Yes.
And what is your sense of sort of the fragmentation of our information and the transparency that we give to students and parents in making what is one of the most important financial decisions of their life? How is that?
Woefully inadequate.
Why do you think that is?
Well, one reason is the Department of Education is prohibited from collecting data on students who don't receive student aid, which is about 30% of students. And so we only know what we make colleges report to us. We don't know how well students succeed after they transfer, they articulate to a different program. We only have limited insight into how well they do in the workforce. And so there are a lot of really critical questions that just can't be answered by a student deciding where to enroll right now.
And I used to teach community college. I taught Business 101, how to write a business plan, start a company at Modesto Junior College in my community. What about community college students? You mentioned four-year students. What access to information do you have if you're doing a two-year degree?
Well, it varies by state, but again, it is hard to know whether a two-year college graduate will go on to earn a four-year college degree or how likely that is. Again, access to labor market data for those who earning occupational degrees is hard to come by, very rare at a program level, which is really what you want, and rare to get disaggregated by student characteristics.
And so, and is there any federal standard that sort of standardizes the amount of information that students have when they're getting a two-year degree, or even a set of standards to know, what are the college graduation rates at one university versus, or one two-year degree or four-year degree as opposed to another? Is there any sort of standardization in that? So you sort of, as you're making one of the most important financial and lifelong decisions, you have sort of a good understanding of where you get the most bang for your buck?
There is, the Department of Education operates what's called the College Scorecard. Again, though, it's limited in the data it has. So you mentioned graduation rates, and what the department measures is students enrolling for the first time as full-time students. And so the success of many students, like Ms. Parker, would not be captured in those statistics.
So in other words, we really have two problems going on here. One is we have the cost of education that has been skyrocketing while we've been disinvesting in higher education. And the second is there's no information. This is why I'm actually sponsoring a bill that tries to make sure that we're standardizing some of these decisions, and I look forward to working across the aisle with some of my colleagues to make that a reality. Thank you so much, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser.
Thank you, Chairman Scott and Dr. Fox, for holding a hearing on this extremely important issue of college affordability. Thank you to all of our witnesses very much for taking the time to share your expertise with this committee. As we've heard this morning, tuition fees at our institutions of higher education are rising well over the inflation rate by at least 3 percentage points. And it's almost an automatic increase, just virtually every year. In most institutions, the cost goes up. And this has been happening for 20 years at least, maybe more, despite the vast number and growing number of job openings in our economy. We have a skills gap that must be addressed, and yet our costs continue to soar. The average cost of attending a private four-year institution or four-year university is $50,000. So I'll start with the $50,000 question, if you will, or in actually Ms. Parker's case, the $66,000 question. What is being done to rein in these costs? I know some of this has been addressed. What is being done to truly provide a value, for a return on the investment, lowering cost, best education, appropriate and effective job placement by these institutions, by these schools? Dr. Weber, I'll ask you.
Thank you for the question. One of the biggest things that I can say at Temple University first is an initiative called Fly in 4, which is trying to keep students on track to graduate in a reasonable time frame, and if they take longer than the 4 years, but they have met certain performance goals, then they'll they won't have to pay for classes after this point, as long as they have been, kind of meeting certain benchmarks. In terms of the job placement, I think that the best place for colleges of all types to invest in is internship programs, that the returns to a strong career placement and internship program are very, very large. And I can say that in my college, there's been a strong push towards making partnerships with businesses in the local community and really investing in this.
Great. I'm certainly a fan of Temple University, and I really hear some great things, and I think your applications rate are a reflection of that. So go Owls.
I'm a big fan as well.
So go Owls. All right, very good. Dr. Akers, another university that does very well is Purdue University. Mitch Daniels has done some remarkable things there, and his staff, lowering costs, just making the school more attractive, and definitely delivering on job placement. Are other schools following this model, and maybe you could comment on that?
Sure. So one of the innovations I'm particularly interested in that Mitch Daniels has brought to Purdue is the Back-a-Boiler program, which is their college-specific income share agreement. What that does in the case of Purdue is takes university funds and basically invests in students. So the institution is putting their own finances at risk and aligning the incentives so that when their students succeed, they succeed as an institution. We've seen that they were the first to start a program like that. We've seen other traditional institutions following suit and creating income share agreements as well. The University of Utah was, I think, the most recent large university to go in that direction. Purdue was also a leader in their recent action of acquiring Kaplan, in that they have a dramatic expansion of their online education program. I think this is a space where traditional institutions have underutilized the potential for technology to lower the cost of their provision of education. So I'm hoping that we'll see other schools following suit in that area as well.
All right, terrific, thank you. And Dr. Morrison-Shetler, I just want to focus on vocational skill learning as well as filling the jobs gap that exists. Now, you mentioned in your written testimony the importance of vocational and career education. What sort of resources, what percentage of resources go towards your technical end of your school, and do the students receive the same level of student loans for vocational skills?
The NC Promise program makes sure that every degree that a student wants to pursue is affordable, and that means reduction in tuition, particularly for in-state students, to $500. The other things that we've done in terms of making sure that the students leave with less debt, for example, is that with that reduction in tuition, it's about $3,000 savings per year for our in-state students. The other things that we've done, we've had a 3% cap on our fees per year, so that those fees don't keep increasing, as you mentioned. I think that's really important to say. And across the system, we have an 8-semester fixed tuition program. And so when people are coming in to get a degree, whatever kind of degree they are getting, they're getting the skills that they need. It was previously mentioned by my colleague here, internship programs, experiential learning opportunities, which allow anyone who are in any field of education to be able to show, while they're getting their degree, that they have the skills that they need to be successful. We're also seeing that our students are getting jobs based on the experiences that they're getting. And so with the cost perspective of it, the state of North Carolina is decreasing the cost for students so that they can then get the experiences they need, get the jobs that they need when they graduate, and give back to the economy.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Macbeth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I begin asking my questions, I'd like to echo my colleague, Mr. Hardin's comments. But first, by responding to the references made about the need to reduce administrative burden on colleges, it's important to keep in mind that federal regulation and oversight provides vital protections for our students. This is particularly important for low-income students and students of color who who are more likely to be burdened by unmanageable debt and to be victims of fraud and abuse by unscrupulous institutions. There are, however, some bipartisan proposals for reducing compliance costs, such as the College Transparency Act. This bill would lift the ban on the collection of student-level data and make it easier for colleges to satisfy their reporting requirements. The College Transparency Act would also provide students and families with better information on the educational and workforce outcomes, which gets at some of the problems about transparency that were raised earlier today. It is true that the demographics of post-secondary students are more diverse today than ever before. More women are attending and graduating from college than men. In Georgia, the state in which I represent, 59% of college students are women. Across the country, we're also seeing increases in the number of students of color and students with a disability attending college. These trends are very, very exciting, but we still have so much more to do to address the systemic inequalities that still exist today. Low-income students and students of color are disproportionately affected by the costs of education and the lack of available funding, resulting in lower rates of matriculation, retention, and graduation. In Georgia and across the country, most Americans will need to attain a post-secondary degree to achieve or maintain a middle-class income. In fact, by 2020, 65% of the jobs in my state alone will require some level of higher education. Specifically, 22% will require a bachelor's degree. If a college degree continues to be the surest path to economic mobility in our society, we need to make sure that everyone has the resources, especially financial resources that they need. That is why it's critical for us to invest in Pell Grants. In Georgia's 6th Congressional District, over 6,000 students received Pell Grants for the 2018 and 2019 school year, totaling nearly $30 million. And for the state of Georgia, more than 230,000 Pell Grants were awarded to students. This brings the total for the state to just over $900 million. Now, I'm proud to say that Georgia State University, an institution with campuses in my district, is one of the many institutions in Georgia to make great strides to narrow the funding gap for low-income and first-generation students. At Georgia State, 51% of the students are receiving Pell Grants. However, for first-generation college students, navigating the financial burdens is not the only obstacle that they face. Students face a culture shift from the comfort of their hometowns and neighborhoods to an environment where many students may not look like them, come from the same background, or belong to the same socioeconomic class. When we talk about higher education, we need to keep those challenges in mind. And I want us also to think beyond tuition costs when talking about completing a college degree. We speak of mental health in K through 12 schooling, but what happens once those students move on to post-secondary education? What happens to those students who receive free or reduced lunch? It is one thing to get a student to college. It's another thing to get them through college. As we begin these conversations, I hope we'll consider the funding needed to help those students navigate their college experience. An accessible, affordable education is crucial to the advancement of our society and to the future and well-being of people that we are here to represent. We cannot expect greater returns in our society unless we are willing to invest more in our schools and the future of our country, our students. Today's students are more diverse than ever before, and I'm thrilled to see so many first-generation college students like Ms. Parker blazing the trail as the first in their families to attend college. Ms. Parker, as you said, balancing multiple priorities can be exhausting and very stressful. We know that mental health supports are critical for students on our college campuses. Can you please talk a little bit more about anything that's helped you manage your stress level while going to school? And also, what more do you think that we, this body, can do to address mental health on college campuses?
Thank you. Last year, I attended counseling services through Columbus State campus, and I guess coming from my community, mental health is not something that is addressed regularly. So once I found out about the counseling services, what they offered, I was like, the first session, I didn't understand why I was there, but I was like, I guess it might be good for me. But throughout the time, I realized how much I needed counseling. All the things that I had been going through over the years of trying to make my way through college, how that was burdensome to me. I think mental health should be a conversation that on college campuses that is a normal conversation instead of being stigmatized, and not just meant for counseling services, not just meant for that area of the institution. I think that's something that should be talked about in advising or in trio services, because no matter who the student is talking to, they see them as an advisor. It doesn't matter if they're a president, if they're in admissions, if there's an instructor, there is still a way to connect with the student, and they look at you as an advisor, as someone that they can, lean in to. It should be a platform of a regular conversation, what mental health is and how it's needed to be able to balance all of what you have going on with the student.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to raise a topic that I haven't heard much about, and just going through your testimony, I haven't seen. And in my home state of Idaho, there's been a couple of things that has worked in a positive way to drive down the overall impact of costs. One is competition. We've got a community college that was put in place in close proximity to our largest university, and since it was put in place, the student growth has exploded there, and the prevailing increase rate of the four-year university greatly slowed down. So that was one thing. The second thing was the implementation of a dual credit system. And I was a proponent of that at the state level, and it's really taken off. And so I'd like to maybe ask Ms. Parker, just because you have a compelling story, and the demographic that you grew up in is just different than the typical demographic in my home state. And so first of all, just a question for you. If you would have had, or maybe you did have, an opportunity to receive college credit while in high school, would that have been something that you would have pursued in your circumstance?
I believe in my high school, my senior year is when Columbus State partnered with my high school to offer the college credit. So it was my senior year, and I was already afraid of college. Going back, knowing what I know now, yes, I would have, but I did not take advantage of it at that time. But mind you, I'm a first-generation student, so.
I understand. Okay. So, and this really could be for anyone, but perhaps I'll just ask Dr. Weber. Have you seen any other states or any other track records where the dual credit system was advantageous or helpful in driving down the overall cost of college?
Yes, I think so. And my home state of Florida, where I grew up, has a robust dual credit system that I took advantage of. I had, I think, 12 or 15 credits from my local community college, and the general cost of college in Florida it's one of the lowest in the country. Now there are other reasons for that as well, but I do think that part of the effect is a robust dual credit system.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield my time, Dr. Fox.
No, I'm not. I'm going to ask you a question, or
yes.
give you some information.
Please.
You hit on an issue I wanted to bring up eventually, and I'm really pleased, and while you're here, I wanted to say it. there's an article that came out February 10th that says that a student that takes at least one dual credit course in high school is 3 times as likely to graduate from college as students who don't take college credit courses in high school. The study also had the higher first, second, and third year GPAs. So I want to compliment the gentleman on bringing up the issue because it is something that is proving to be very, very successful for students. So thank you for bringing up the issue, and I'll yield my time back to you.
The gentlelady want to put that in the record?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to put that in the record.
objection.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. I think the data in our home state would validate that, and I yield to Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman has yielded back his time. Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Washington, Dr. Schreier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I would reiterate, I agree with my colleagues that we have a Running Start program in Washington State that has been incredibly successful. It reduces the cost of college, lets kids get an early start. It's unfortunately not available so much to people in rural areas, but it is a great start. We have heard about college tuition rates. Just for perspective, when I don't think I'm that old, but in the 80s, when I went to college, I took a couple classes at a community college for $5 a credit. Yeah. And I went to UC Berkeley for $2,000 a year. And I graduated from medical school with about $60,000 of debt, which pales in comparison to anything that students today are facing. I came out with an MD. To pay off the same debt that Ms. Parker now is facing without that potential salary earnings. And so I have often said that the way we spend our money is a reflection of our values, and we have just heard about how college education leads to $1 million more in lifetime earnings, leads to a much bigger tax base, and will ultimately pay itself off. And I have always felt that an investment in a home and in education are the only 2 good kinds of debt. And so I wanted to ask, because Dr. Kowal, you mentioned ultimately over time doubling the amount that we give in Pell Grants. I would note that at the University of Washington, we have about an 80% graduation rate for students receiving Pell Grants, which I think is phenomenal compared to a lot of the numbers we've been hearing. Why not just go for it immediately, given what a good investment college education is and the ultimate payoff in tax revenues for our country?
Great, I'm for it. And in fact, the studies show that investments in Pell pay for themselves in terms of increased economic growth. And so it's it would be a very worthwhile investment for Congress to make.
Thank you. And then I would also just note, and then I'll yield back my time in a moment, but that the costs of college today are so different for a person like me who happened to come from a middle-class household and did not have huge expenses, and Ms. Parker, who grew up with adversity. And just the system is so rigged. I mean, as we saw yesterday with the wealthy parents paying their way and false test scores and everything else to get their kids into college, who will have a cakewalk and would have had a cakewalk either way. And Ms. Parker, who has to work and raise a child and get through college, that it just is, I don't think I could have made it through Berkeley doing what you are doing. And I just want to recognize that the cost of college is overwhelming, and I applaud you for your efforts. I yield back my time to the chairman.
Thank you. Let me ask just one question, maybe Dr. Kowal. There's been a reference to the private income-based repayment plan where you make a deal with a private investor to get a percentage of your income. How do those work, and why would anybody prefer that than the federal income-based repayment that we already have?
I think thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I think there is very little reason for any student to prefer a private income share agreement to a federal student loan because of the option of income-driven repayment, which will be a better option for almost every student, if not every student. The federal government has lower cost of capital. It has economies of scale in collecting those loans, and as a result, they offer better rates to students than private lenders will.
Is there any, with the private income-based, with the public income-based repayment, you can just decide if you've got a real good job just to pay off the loan and be finished with it. Do you have that option with the private deals?
Not necessarily. Oftentimes, you have to pay back several times more than the value of your education.
Thank you. That yields back. Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time.
May I take back the balance of my time? I have a letter from the NEA that I would respectfully request to submit. And thank you, and I will yield back to whoever would like my time.
Without objection. Gentleman from South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Parker, in your testimony, because it's a neat story. I know it's been a hard story for you, but it's a neat story to see your persistence. And at the end of your written testimony, you note that you know the odds are low that Journey and I will ever escape poverty. And I just want to echo Ms. Fudge and Dr. Rowe and others who have said you are going to make it. You are going to make it, and I know that because I think it's as true now as it was when President Coolidge said it. But this is what President Coolidge said. Nothing in this world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education alone will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. Ms. Parker, boy, do you have persistence. And you're going to make it, and Journey's going to make it. And I know that you have traveled far and that there are miles yet to go in your journey, but boy, are you going to make it. And so through that journey, I know you have learned a lot. I've got 3 boys. One of them's 13. He hasn't really started to think about what is going to happen after high school yet, but I'd love to get you guys connected. Now, he's not here today, but if he was, and if he says, Ms. Parker, what advice do you have for me about what I can be doing to have a successful experience, whether that's related to affordability or other measures of student success? What would you tell him, ma'am?
Get connected to as many resources as you can. Because that is my experience. I don't know how to do it without it. I don't know any other way. And to always be mindful that just because someone told you that this is the way it is, that does not mean that has to be what it is. Ask questions and continue to stay persistent.
Ask questions. Boy, I think that's very well said. I mean, you'd need to be your own advocate at times in this system. We talked about how complicated it is to navigate. The system is too complicated, but there have been times you've had to be your own advocate, I assume.
Yes, for years. Mm-hmm. Until I realized now, later in my educational journey, that, okay, there should have been a stepping point all those years where I could have been caught and helped and guided.
So we've talked a fair amount today also about there's kind of a lack of transparency and it's hard to understand grants versus loans. Some of the other panelists talked about that. Part of it's also that we're kind of dealing with monopoly money. When you're a young person and you're trying to think about paying something back over 10 or 20 or more years, it's hard to really understand the financial impact that can have. Is there a moment, maybe there wasn't, but was there a moment when you really realized, oh my gosh, this is real money, and I owe it?
I understood that when I was 17 going to the University of Toledo, yet I was only taught to survive. So it was taking out the loans to make basic needs met in order to still stay in school. I went to school with no money. Like I said, I didn't have a comforter for my bed. That was real. When I got there and I arrived and I see all my peers and everyone setting up their room, they came, I didn't even think they came from money. I knew they had money because they had a comforter on their bed. I didn't know what come from money meant until I seen an extensive amount,
You talked in your testimony, and I was glad you did, about how hard you've worked and how many part-time jobs, and at times more than a few of them. And we've also heard from other panelists that can sometimes have a negative impact on student success. But I've got to think right now it'd be hard for you to make it if you were not working. Employment's a key part of your success story now, I would assume. Is that right?
Yes. It's an important part of my success story, and it also has given me experience. So although I was working all these jobs and, in school, I'm able to apply the experience that I've worked in all these jobs to what is relevant to me now and in my career.
Well, this has been very well said. The panelists have done a great job. Ms. Parker, you've done a great job. And I think, we do need to talk about we need to have a robust conversation about what is the role of government in aiding student success and in increasing affordability. But you're a great example of somebody who's also doing what you can on your end. Hard work, curiosity, being your own advocate, being persistent. I mean, there are a lot of things that students need to own to be successful, and ma'am, you are owning them. Mr. Chairman, if I can, I'd like to yield back a little time to the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, to be fair, there's not enough time to ask a question.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Let's see, gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Chilela.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to introduce into the record a letter from CLASP, the Center for Law and Social Policy. To the panel, and I think you've done an excellent job, but tuition is more complicated than just what the sticker price is, because so many of the colleges and universities in this country, with probably the exception of the for-profit institutions, discount tuition in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's a scholarship, sometimes it's just offering a lower price. And so it's hard to analyze whether tuition alone is the factor. And it seems to me that one of the things we've learned is these wraparound services that Ms. Parker has indicated that made a real difference for her. Access to housing, access to other kinds of income and support services, in addition to the fact that she took a job. So could you talk a little about what the actual tuition is and how analysts treat that in relationship to student success?
So I think that you bring up a very good point. There's the sticker price of tuition, what it says on the website, and I do want to say this matters. It does deter people from who just see the prospect of these really big numbers with. And they're very reluctant to take out so much debt, and they're not aware of the financial aid that they're actually going to receive. But then what students actually pay. One of the problems is that what they actually pay is going to differ from year to year. It's not clear what they're going to get from one year to the next. The financial aid packages, that there's so much fine print that you might it expires after 4 years, or you lose it if you fall below certain thresholds, and it's incredibly complex, and this is a real burden to students, I think.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cavell, according to research examining nationally representative data on student demographics, we found that while academic programs at for-profit colleges are more similar to those at public community colleges, borrowing patterns for students who attend for-profits are more similar to the not-for-profit four-year colleges. It seems like me to a mismatch in the types of programs for-profits offers and the cost. Have you looked at that differential in looking at the cost of college?
Yes, you're right. Programs at for-profit colleges tend to have much higher tuitions, and they tend to have much, much higher percentages of students who borrow.
And what about the retention and graduation rates?
The retention and graduation rates are mixed. The for-profit colleges tend to offer shorter programs, but if you do it on an apples-to-apples basis, they're very similar, or if anything, community colleges have slightly better retention rates.
Dr. Shetler, can you talk a little about the wraparound services that you provide to students? I mean, you talked about very low tuition, and you obviously have a large number of students that work and go to school at your institution. What kinds of services do you provide to support students?
Educational support obviously is things like advising and to attain the skills that they need to be successful in their degree. Tuition is at Western is about $3,000 a year.
Right.
Total cost of attendance with NC Promise is $14,000. So it's room and board and the other support, health services that need to be in place that are often the additional costs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Ms. Parker, I think you're going to do very well in the future. I'd like to be helpful. I actually know a lot of HR people in Ohio. And so if you connect up with me after this hearing, I'd be happy to provide some introductions to you, because I'm going to make sure that you don't end up living in poverty for the rest of your life. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Today's time has expired. Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The cost of higher education has unjustifiably run rampant in recent years, and the overall cost of college is increasing as a result of many underwritten factors, including administrative costs. While some of my colleagues claim that college can and should be free, the fact is college can never truly be free. Costs are simply masked. That being said, students should have the option to attend an institution that prepares and enables them to be contributing members of society. The problem of accessibility is twofold, which includes both the access for students to attend and their success and completion while at college. We should not reach a point at which the cost of education is entirely prohibitive, but recognizing this, just as accessibility is important, so are graduation rates. So, Mr. Weber, I'd ask you, in your testimony, you state that only 60% of students at four-year schools will earn a degree within 6 years of initial enrollment. With more and more resources at schools being devoted to administrative costs, why are we not seeing a higher percentage of graduation, and what benefits are they providing, if not contributing to student success by ensuring their graduation?
Well, one of the issues is doing an apples-to-apples comparison. So over time, at the typical public institution, graduation rates have stayed roughly constant. But that is despite public institutions educating a much different type of student today than 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so from an apples-to-apples comparison, in some sense, our graduation rates have increased because because they've stayed the same, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Dr. Morrison-Shetler, I'm reading your testimony, very interested in NC Promise. Sounds very exciting. How long have you been chancellor, interim chancellor?
Just slightly over 1 year.
And are you familiar with your budgets over the last, say, decade? I mean, can you speak to those budgets and the increases in your budgets?
To a certain extent, yes.
Okay. Can you approximate for me how much the budget has increased over the past 10 years per year by average?
Let me ask that question. I just wanted to make sure it was somebody who actually has the numbers. So actually, over the last decade, we've stayed relatively the same. What has happened is that we've had a decrease in sort of capital expenditures or the ability to invest in our current capital, and that is changing. With NC Promise, we're beginning to see folks look at the cost of attendance at the university and to make sure that we have the budget that we need to be able to educate a growing population.
That is not the answer I expected, so I want to commend you for keeping your budgets under control. And given that you have seen such a spike in enrollment, can you speak to other ways in which you as a higher education institution have managed to control costs on your own? Because from my perspective, and I have a lot of different colleges and universities in my district, they see continuing pressures on their costs. And because you're universities getting so much support from the state to keep your tuition fixed and low, I was curious whether or not you all were making it a goal to actually control costs. And so can you speak to those?
Most definitely, and I had mentioned this previously, but one of the things that the NC Promise is doing is helping us with retention, and so having our students be able to stay on at the university is reducing their cost, total cost of education.
Not their costs, your costs.
My costs. So one of the things that again, the system is doing is capped fees, and so that we can't go above 3% in terms of increasing our fees. So what we have to do, if we're not getting those additional funds, then we're looking at reallocating to make sure that we're focusing. Western Carolina University doesn't do everything. It does specific things really well. And so in past years, prior to my time coming to Western Carolina, we looked at program prioritization. What are the kinds of programs that we're doing? Is it the right programs for our region? And if it's not, then are we eliminating those programs and focusing more our resources in other areas? The other things that we do, reallocation of resources is always the key to this. If you don't have the money, what are your priorities? And the values of your institution, follow the money. And so we have a very strong strategic plan that has a focus on success, student success, time to graduation, retention, and we make sure our resources follow those values, those metrics, and the issues that we are accountable for. So,
Thank you very much.
Reallocation.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to submit into the record 2 letters highlighting the critical importance of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, one from the American Federation of Teachers and the other from 127 national and state animal health science professional membership organizations.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I believe strongly that restoring the middle class means we must stop shortchanging our students. All students in our country deserve a high-quality education that helps them reach their full potentials, and we must invest in higher education so students like Ms. Parker aren't buried in debt when they graduate. I also believe strongly in loan forgiveness for those who make the financial sacrifice to use their skills in public service, such as working as teachers, firefighters, public defenders, nurses, or members of the military. The PSLF, or the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, created with bipartisan support in 2007, offers loan forgiveness to individuals after they work in public service careers for 10 years. The program was designed to ensure that talented individuals, including teachers, service members, and veterans, can pursue careers in public service even if they take out loans to obtain a degree. Dr. Quall, I'd like to ask you a question. I think we worked together in previous lives. It's good to see you again. What would eliminating the PSLF program do to diversity of the public sector workforce? Would it make it harder for underrepresented groups to pursue careers in teaching and nursing and like?
It would. We know low-income students and students of color are more likely to borrow, and they borrow more. And so it would make those career choices more challenging for them.
And how would eliminating this program make it harder for low-income individuals in particular to pursue careers in public service?
Well, we know student debt is an obstacle for students making their career choices, and students with higher debts are less likely to choose low-paid careers, including public service careers.
Thank you. Today's college students often struggle to find adequate, affordable housing options near their campus. In fact, researchers believe that the population of homeless students in higher education is close to 1.5 million. Furthermore, a recent GAO report examining college student hunger found that low-income students, first-generation students, and single parents are at greater risk of being food insecure. Ms. Parker, I was so moved by your story of struggling to find housing for you in Journey. Thank you for sharing this experience, and I'm inspired by how you've overcome that difficult time in your life. Can you tell us a little more about what difference the stable housing that you found has made for you, and can you expand more on how you were able to find stable housing?
Thank you. I was able to find the housing through our advising. We have a special circumstances advising at Columbus State, and they directed me in the direction of Scholar House. And
what is Scholar House?
okay.
Who lives there?
Student parents. So it's a community of student parents, and they provide programming for us. So we have things for like mentoring, coaching, financial literacy programming offered to us. That's like a requirement, and it's a partnership between CMHA, Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority and Community Properties of Ohio. That get a Section 8 voucher to allow us to have it at a low
So it's sort of a cooperative program of different agencies working together to make sure people can get housing.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. I think we need more of that, not less. Part of the president's budget was released this week, where the administration recommends eliminating subsidized undergraduate student loans. Republicans have also proposed eliminating subsidized loans. Currently, undergraduate students can receive subsidized loans allocated based on financial need, which do not accrue interest while they're in school. Dr. Quall, how would eliminating subsidized loans for undergraduates affect students? And does this help make college more accessible and affordable?
The president's proposal would use those funds to reduce the deficit. It would raise costs by thousands of dollars for many students over the life of their loans, and it would not make college more affordable.
Finally, let me ask a clarifying question to you, Dr. Weber. There were some proposals offered by the minority about limiting borrowing among certain students to reduce debt loads. Do you believe debt loads, particularly among low-income students, are the result of frivolous or unnecessary spending, or are they a reflection of rising prices and insufficient grant aid?
I absolutely believe they are the latter, rising prices and insufficient debt aid. I think there are very limited circumstances where some students, maybe because of lack of financial counseling, do borrow too much, and so I think that schools should have more flexibility to be able to counsel those
More
students.
advising and counseling rather than limiting the amount they can borrow if they need it.
Exactly.
Okay. All right, my time's expired. Thank you all so much. It's a really important subject.
Thank you. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Trone.
Thank you all for being here this long day. It's nearing the end. Mr. Parker, I commend you for your phenomenal hard work and perseverance, and you're absolutely going to be successful, and you'll knock it out of the park. Just keep at it. My question is, we've been looking at a higher education and a education system that really hasn't changed much in the last 100, almost 50 years. We've been a K-12 system, and then we have 2-year or 4-year college. Everything else has changed in 150 years. I mean, our students have changed, their interests have changed, where they would go to graduate school, that has all changed. What has changed, the type of jobs they're going to get has changed. The way we communicate knowledge has changed. I'd like to get some people's thoughts about, is this system just yesterday's system and something we just keep going with because it's there? Or should we be trying to move to something more like a pre-K to 14 that's 100% free, covers all those wraparound costs that we talked about a while ago? And who in this, what state has done a best practice in this area that could be something we can learn from and emulate? Start with Dr. Morrison-Shelter.
I think the comment about free is always difficult to sort of determine. One of the things that NC Promise does is a little different from others, is that it's the first dollar. And so the students come and they know what their tuition is going to be, they know what their other costs are going to be, and then they can apply other loans and grants to that. So I think making this a process that's more transparent, making a process that is more accessible, particularly for low-income or first-generation students, would be really, really important. And making sure that our education is helping our students get the right kind of jobs. At Western Carolina University, we do needs assessment in our community. What are the skills that are needed? What are the kinds of things that would help our economy? And a nimble enough university to be able to say, okay, we need to be focusing on growing those particular things. So I think really knowing what your circumstances are, we're in rural Western North Carolina, we know what the needs of our community are, and as an institution we meet those needs and we exceed those needs if we possibly can, but we have to be nimble to be able to do that.
Other thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, if I might, there is an interesting experiment happening in Detroit with the Kresge Foundation about combining K-12 schools with a four-year residential college. It would be interesting to explore with you.
How many states actually have a quote-unquote free first dollar or last dollar community college, two-year college? Anybody have a number on that?
I don't think there is any state that is entirely free.
Tennessee? No?
Tennessee is covered in large part using Pell Grants. They have a last dollar scholarship.
Okay. Let's talk about workforce a minute. We support, there's a lot of ideas and innovation, promoting multiple pathways to students to learn and success in the workplace. At the end of the day, that's what they're looking for, success in the workplace and a job. And sometimes these programs don't actually prepare people adequately. But what kind of safeguards do we need if we're spending federal financial aid dollars to folks to help pursue workforce-focused programs? Are students able to use their federal financial aid to help in these workforce programs?
In many cases, students are able to choose degrees or certificates offered by community colleges or trade schools that have direct occupational value. In order to get a Pell Grant, you must be attending a program at least the length of a traditional academic semester, which is 15 weeks. There are some proposals to allow shorter-term programs to receive Pell Grants. Those programs may not necessarily be offered for academic credit. They may not necessarily be accredited. And so my view is there are a lot of those programs that are high in quality and that are worthy of support, but we do need to be careful, not just the types of programs that meet those criteria today, but the types of programs that might be created to meet those criteria.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has almost expired. Thank you. The gentlelady from North Carolina is Ranking Member Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Ms. Parker, I want to congratulate you on getting your associate's degree and on continuing your education. I will tell you that I was very, very poor growing up, but I worked my way through college. It took me 7 years, and I had a family. And so I want to encourage you, as other people have, to continue to do what you do, because getting your degree, I hope, will be worthwhile for you. It has certainly been for me, and so I commend you for continuing to do what you're doing. Dr. Akers, I want to go back to the issue of the public service loan forgiveness programs. And in your testimony, you mentioned that it's estimated to cost $24 billion over the next 10 years. Could you give a few examples of how the PSLF is inequitable and poorly designed?
Sure. So I have no objection to subsidizing employment in careers that serve the public good and that are undersubscribed with the market wages that exist in them. But I firmly believe that the student lending program is the wrong place to provide those subsidies. It's sort of an obvious example of where there's inequity is you could imagine two nurses working in a nonprofit hospital system. One of them went to college and had the experience that Ms. Parker talked about with pizza and partying in dorms, and then the other, scrimped and saved to have a low-cost experience. The individual who has high amount of debt will have their loans forgiven, essentially receiving a very large subsidy of taxpayer dollars, while the person who was more careful with their spending does not receive this subsidy. I would much prefer if we just choose to support particular professions, that those subsidies be delivered through something like a tax credit that motivates all individuals to enter that profession rather than just those who have spent large sums on their education.
Well, thank you for that example. I think, of course, what Ms. Parker said, her idea before she went to college was that it was a vacation. And I think many people see that the taxpayers are subsidizing those kinds of students who are going to college to be on vacation and not having the kind of seriousness that other students have. And I think your example is an excellent one. Dr. Morrison-Shetler, thank you for coming to Washington to testify about the wonderful things that are going on at Western Carolina and other places in North Carolina. I think talking about the Carolina Promise, talking about the programs that you all have where students can transfer from community college and make sure that their credits transfer into their degree programs. I happen to think North Carolina is doing a lot of good things in that regard. Dual enrollment in high school that costs absolutely nothing. And that is, by the way, correct all throughout the state. I know you were a little unsure about how to answer that question before, but it's been going on a long time before I was involved and before Ms. Adams and I were both in the General Assembly, that program started. So it's been going on a long time. It's been very successful. But I know improving the economic mobility of your students is an important value to you, and you alluded to that. Could you share with us what you're doing on campus to work with businesses and industry to make the transition from college graduate to employee seamless for your students?
We have a very robust career and professional development service for our students that allows us to find businesses and industries in our area that are interested in taking our students before they graduate so that they're eligible for getting the experiences that Ms. Parker talked about as she did in her work experience. These are really important connections to be made, and we live in an area where the businesses and industries are very supportive of our student success, and a high percentage of our students, when they do these internships or practicums, end up being employed by those businesses and industries, and therefore, as I mentioned earlier, stay in the area and contribute back to the economy.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Weber, I want to say again, a special thank you for being here today and for the written testimony that you provided, which is very, very helpful to us. And Dr. Gaval, thank you. And again, Ms. Parker, thank you so much for coming and sharing your experiences. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of you for being here today. As one of 8 children, I was able to put myself through college with a smorgasbord of help, whether it was the Perkins loans, the Pell Grants, student work study, and it was significantly important to me, but we're finding more and more that students are not having that same opportunity. And in fact, research from the Brookings Institute predicts that by 2023, nearly 40% of borrowers may default on their loans. So to me, this indicates that we do have a student loan default crisis, which is a much bigger crisis for minority and low-income students, particularly those who attend for-profit colleges. The study finds that default for students at for-profit schools is almost 4 times that of those that attend community colleges. We also know that Black students are 3 times more likely to enroll in for-profit colleges than their peers, and students at the bottom quartile are twice as likely to enroll at for-profit colleges than students in the top. Mr. Quall, I wanted to ask you, given these statistics, can you explain why students who attend for-profit institutions are at greater risk of default?
For-profit colleges tend to be significantly more expensive. They tend to be priced at the level that would require you to borrow a federal student loan at the maximum level. They often offer mediocre education or worse. And as a result, we do see a lot of students defaulting or failing to make payments on their student loans.
Thank you. You had said earlier that, like you said, that students that qualify from these for-profit colleges actually may do worse in the labor market than they otherwise would do, even if they didn't go to school. This happens even though the credentials they offer tend to be 30 to 40% more expensive. ABC interviewed a young veteran, Brian Babcock, a couple years ago, who served our country in Iraq, and his plan was police work when he graduated. He used his GI Bill money to pursue criminal justice degree at ITT Tech, which we all know what happened with that. He heard about the school on a commercial. ITT promised him that all police agencies would take his credential, and they even helped him fill out the student loan application, which led him to borrow up to $70,000. He went on to apply to 20 to 23 police departments to only find out that none of them recognized this degree. We just discovered today, and this is a particularly important point in Nevada, we have a lot of for-profit universities that have shut their doors, 30 in the last 10 years. And we just discovered today that 1,733 GI Bill recipients were affected by the most recent closures of the Dream Education schools, of which one is in my district alone. Can you explain more specifically, speak to why minority students and veterans tend to be the target of these predatory recruitment practices by for-profits?
I think in many cases, students don't have experience with college. They have family members who don't have experience with college. We know that for-profit colleges engage in very high pressure or sometimes deceptive recruiting tactics. In 2010, the GAO sent undercover investigators to for-profit colleges. All 15 found misleading statements. 4 of them found fraudulent statements. The veterans are particularly attractive to for-profit colleges because they generate revenue outside of what is called the 90-10 rule, which limits revenue to 90% of student aid. And so for all of those reasons, you see the practices of for-profit colleges falling disproportionately heavily on the communities you mentioned.
Thank you. Real quickly, we're running out of time. Any quick suggestions for what the federal government can do to protect these students?
I think it's really important to have standards to make sure that students graduate, can find jobs, and repay their loans. I think it's important to crack down on the use of commissioned salespeople, which lead to a lot of this deceptive information. I would certainly include GI benefits and DoD spending in the limitation on the amount of federal funds that these for-profit colleges can include. And I think that students who are defrauded should have a right to get their loans forgiven, which is true in theory, but not in practice today.
Correct. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Massachusetts, Ms. Strahan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. It's so important to all of us. I was born and raised in a working-class family in Lowell. I was one of 4 girls and attended public schools my entire life. If not for a volleyball scholarship, I wouldn't have gone to the college that I had gone to. And so I'm so uniquely aware of the anxiety that goes around education and funding your own education. The school tuition had a high sticker price then, but I think what's more alarming to me is that in the last 25 years, I've seen that sticker price increase 3x in 25 years. So, Mr. Qual, I looked at the student debt report that TICA put out last September, and more than 200,000 colleges granting bachelor's degrees carried an average debt of more than $35,000. I mean, today we heard Ms. Parker's testimony, and your $66,000 debt. I just want to ask a couple of basic, questions on this, because it would be, I think it's helpful for us to know what the major drivers are for these tuition increases.
Well, for most students, 3/4 of students go to public institutions. And for those students, the single biggest driver has been declining state support over the last few decades.
Yep. But, so that's fair. I've got 3 stepsons. I've toured lots of college campuses in the last 10 years, and I've also seen a bit of an amenities arms race, whether it's the dorms, the cafeterias, the gyms. And I'm wondering if you could speak to has the quality of education or the job readiness, not just the student experience, has it risen as a result of these tuition hikes?
Well, I think in part, colleges do have a challenge because they employ highly educated workforce, it's highly paid. It's difficult to become more productive like other parts of the economy because you can't have more than 20 students in a seminar without the seminar getting worse. I also think many of our colleges are chasing prestige in a way that's measured by the U.S. News and World Report, for example, which measures academic quality by the amounts institutions spend, not the amount that students learn. And we don't value community colleges and regional universities that are inclusive and affordable and higher in quality.
Great, that's helpful. And you mentioned, I think you're the only one in your testimony who sort of used the word accountability. What accountability measures should we employ to make sure that our young people, frankly, get the return on their huge investment?
Well, the most basic question, I think, for federal policymakers is, can students repay their loans? We've had the cohort default rate in statute for 30 years. It's long been bipartisan, widely accepted. It's no longer very effective at driving down student loan defaults. So there's a series of reforms you could make to revitalize the student loan default rate. I think there are other things that are worthy in other areas. For example, the gainful employment rules apply to occupational programs, often at for-profit colleges, and look at typical debts relative to expected earnings.
Great, thank you. I'm going to switch gears because I still have a little bit of time left. So we heard from Ms. Parker's testimony that far too many students and their children, like Journey, are going hungry while you're nobly trying to learn and get ahead. The help they need isn't reaching them. The GAO recently found that of the 3.3 million students, and I think this was referenced earlier, who were potentially eligible for SNAP benefits in 2016, less than half said they participated. So Chancellor Morrison-Shetler, I'm wondering if you could help with your experience. Is student hunger an issue you see at Western Carolina? And if so, what are your recommendations for helping students?
Student hunger is definitely something that we're seeing in, I think, all of our institutions. It is a big issue, and it's something that we at Western and across the system are really, really conscious of, making sure that students get to the resources that they need to be able to be successful. Western Carolina University, we've collaborated with the Baptist Children's Home to create a food bank and resources for students who are homeless, who have issues, and they are referred through sometimes by faculty, by staff, but we really got to get the information out to people about the resources that they have available to them, as Ms. Parker has mentioned. And I think communication is the big issue. We've got to get that information out, and it has to be done in a way that's compassionate and respectful for the person who's being affected, because that is one area where if people don't feel like they're being valued or respected, they'll just leave, and so retention will become an issue.
Great. Thank you. I've run out of time, so I yield back, but thank you all so much for being here today.
Your ladies' time has expired. Gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding these important hearings. Thank you to the panel for being here. This has been an issue that's been important to me for some years, and I think that, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Quall, when you were with the Obama administration and I was writing my bill in the state Senate for the Washington Promise Act, I believe we worked with you, so thank you for your help back then. And we did just in Seattle, we have one of the best community college systems in the country. We did just in Seattle add a 13th year to sort of the K-12 continuum, and so we're excited to see how that goes. In Washington State, just to echo some of the comments of my colleague that just spoke, we went from the state covering 66% of the cost of college, public universities in 2008, to now covering only 35%. And we're in a very high, very unaffordable, let's put it that way, area in terms of our living costs. So the challenges for students are tremendous, and I want to congratulate you, Ms. Parker, and all of the students across our country who go through such challenges. Let me start with you, Chancellor, and thank you so much for your work on the North Carolina Promise program. I wanted to ask if you could zero in a little bit on what you have found around college accessibility and income diversity of your students in particular. Any specific reflections on that connection?
The metrics that the UNC system have put forward to us as a result of just affordability and access across the system, but then also including NC Promise, is really to focus on making sure that low-income students, first-generation students, have access to a high-quality, affordable degree. And as a result, the NC Promise system chose 3 institutions that allow students less than 150 miles travel to get to college where they can get a 4-year degree, which means that you're basically supporting your community. And that's really, really important. And so people coming to Western and to Pembroke and to Elizabeth City are people who want to have a high-quality education, wouldn't normally have been able to afford it, but with NC Promise, that has allowed them to do that. So we are seeing increases in retention and time to graduation, even in the fact that we've just been at this for a short period of time. But we're seeing particularly student retention because they're not having the financial impact that they would have otherwise.
That's perfect, because my next question was going to be around, sometimes we separate cost and affordability from completion. And in my experience, and the students I've spoken to, and I've talked to tens of thousands now across Washington State, there's a very direct connection, because if you don't have the aid, if you have to go out and have a second job or a third job, if you can't afford your textbooks or a computer now, because everything's, it really affects your ability to complete. And so can you speak to that? I know it's early, but can you speak to that, and perhaps any of the other panelists that might want to comment on that relationship, because they're so often separated. What comments do you have around that, completion? And
NC Promise is a first dollar program, and so students know exactly how much it's going to cost with their tuition and their fees, room and board, etc. And so that knowledge allows planning, that knowledge allows seeking other resources to complete that cost of attendance, and that is something that I would love to see as having a simpler process, a more transparent process, something that first-generation students or low-income students can have access to and be successful at. That would be a huge game changer for the people and the students that you're talking about.
well, and actually, I just want to say before asking if any of you have comments on that, that I actually have championed a proposal to invest in a federal-state partnership to make public college both 4-year and 2-year tuition and fee-free for everybody. And under the plan, the federal government would cover 2/3 of the cost of eliminating tuition and fees, and the states would cover 1/3. And I believe that actually that's a really important cornerstone of higher education reauthorization. But you look like you were going to say something, Dr. Weber.
Yes, I was just going to say that I think you hit the nail right on the head with respect to affordability and completion, that on average, a college degree pays off in spades. And this is true for the vast majority of people. But risk is really the important thing here, that downside risk. The people who are in the single worst position are those who do not complete. And for them, college is not affordable.
Exactly. Dr. Quall, I just have a couple seconds here.
Just to add, we have this idea of college students as being upper middle class, temporarily eating Taco Bell, and the reality of their lives today are really very different. And we need to think about costs of supporting children, other family members, emergency expenses. There's a whole range of costs that get in the way of completion that we don't deal with.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize myself for a couple of questions. I see the votes have been called. Mr. Quall, you mentioned the problems with the public service loan forgiveness, that it's good in theory, but is problematic in reality. Is the problem legislative or administrative?
Both. I think it would help to simplify the types of repayment plans that are eligible for public service loan forgiveness. The types of employment is unclear, could be clarified by the department, could also be clarified by Congress.
You're saying that somebody can be working year after year thinking they're in a plan and not knowing, and you get after the 10 years, all of a sudden, you don't get any credit?
That's not only hypothetical, that's happened.
And is that legislative or administrative?
There is a mess. In many cases, the department has given inaccurate, or its contractors have, inaccurate information to students. But I think there is an opportunity for Congress to fix it.
Are you talking about a problem with servicers?
Yes.
And you mentioned the cost of the for-profit colleges is higher than community college for the same program. How much higher? Is it close?
It's many times higher.
Many times? Like 3, 4, 5 times?
3, 4, or 5 times is a fair estimate.
Ms. Morrison, you talked about the North Carolina Promise, and you also mentioned a significant improvement in graduation rates in several colleges. How much did the financial assistance contribute to the increased graduation rate?
We are early on in the NC Promise, and so our 6-year graduation rate at Western over the last 6 years has gone from 50% to 60%. I anticipate that with NC Promise, we will see an increase in graduation rate. It is too early at this point in time to say.
Is there a limit on how many students can participate?
Now, any of the students who are enrolled at the 3 institutions have NC Promise.
So if you can get into the institution, you get the rate?
Correct.
You don't have to have a minimum grade point average to get in?
We have the standards set by the institutions for entry, and if the student attains those or exceeds those, then they have the possibility of coming to those 3 institutions.
Now, has this benefit of these 3 colleges had an adverse effect on enrollment at other colleges?
And not that we have data to show. In fact, those institutions who have said that they've seen a decrease as a result of NC Promise, the numbers just don't jive. We're seeing 6.6% increase, other institutions 14 and 19% increase. So it's what we are seeing particularly with transfer students is that the transfer students are coming from the same places that we're transferring from before. There's just more of them because it's a more affordable option.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Parker, you mentioned assistance you got from counselors. How important was their advice in making it possible for you to stay and complete your degree and stay in school where you are now?
Extremely important. Their advice that they gave me were coping skills on how to deal with anxiety when dealing with things like finances or worrying about childcare or just coping mechanisms so that I can still stay focused, and it was extremely helpful.
Do you know how these counselors were paid for? Were any of them in a TRIO program, like Student Support Services?
I also have an advisor for the TRIO.
Has that been helpful?
Yes, very helpful, connecting me to scholarships and resources, guiding me.
Thank you. In light of the time, Ranking Member, I'll complete my questions now and submit others for the record. Does the Ranking Member have closing comments?
I do, Mr. Chairman, and again, in light of the time, I will abbreviate my comments. I do want to say that I will submit to Dr. Weber a question about a comment he made about Temple that I'd like to have some clarification on, but I'll do that. Mr. Chairman, I want to again commend you for having this hearing and appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with you on it. But there's a void in our focus, I think, today, and that's the issue of the responsibility of the institutions and the states. Because we see over and over that the issue is completion. I'm looking forward to some of the other hearings in this series that'll help us focus more on why so few students are completing and why so many students are not seeking the educational program that best suits their interest. And what is the responsibility of the institution, the student, and the state? I'm frankly flabbergasted by what we heard from Ms. Parker about the lack of concern by the University of Toledo for her. I think that points out, again, lots of problems at the state level. And I want to believe that no student going to an institution in North Carolina would have faced that total lack of concern. We've had a lot of hearings on post-secondary education over the years, and as time goes on, statistics add up. It's becoming clear that none of the issues stand alone. Mr. Chairman, you and I share a love for methodical processes, and a topical approach makes sense to many. But as our witnesses have shown us today, each topic leads directly to another. That's why this committee must focus on the following touchstones for reform: strengthening innovation and completion, modernizing federal student aid, and promoting student opportunities. We haven't even touched on some of the newer elements that are finally being considered within the context of post-secondary education. Just the other day, I read about how population challenges are beginning to impact small liberal arts colleges. According to a new study by economist Nathan Grahl, there'll be 450,000 fewer students entering the post-secondary system in the 2020s because there are fewer people being born in this country. Without the tuition revenue supported by the students, colleges are going to need to figure out a way to adapt, and it's imperative for our country's workforce that the system supports students in completing an affordable post-secondary education of some kind. Mr. Chairman, you and I share a passion for seeing skills education play a bigger role, but we cannot forget about small institutions and the role of the liberal arts. Students must have options. I look forward to continuing these conversations with you in our next hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. And one of the things that we want to make sure we don't leave out is access to liberal arts education. Many people want to have a formula where you can monetize your education the day after you get your degree. That's not often possible with a liberal arts degree, but the long-term benefits in terms of transformation of the student, I think, is extremely important.
And as an English major, you know I agree.
And for those who are academically qualified and make that choice, we don't want to limit that choice just to those who can write the big tuition checks. But we've heard today that a quality education is out of reach for too many of our students. We've heard how federal and state disinvestment from public higher education has hindered and under-resourced the school's ability to reach all of our students. We've heard how the weakening federal grant programs and supportive services have made it difficult for students to access higher education, and I think we have an obligation, particularly with the state disinvestment. We heard that going from Pell Grant covering about 75% going to 25%, well, that triples the cost to the student right there. Just in the Pell Grants, inflation has made the portion they pay even more expensive. So obviously we have to do something, and today's hearing was extremely important and informative for us to get our job done, and I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. Thank you, and without objection, the committee hearing is adjourned.